Chapter 83. When the bell rang for the third time, the students walked out of their respective study rooms. Some students who lived for a long time hurried to the kitchen so that they would not miss the special meal on the first day of school. Some students who were returning to Chang and hurried to the meadow in the academy so that they would not miss the celebration party of their friends in the city. Most of the students packed up their books and followed the quiet alley beside the study rooms to the depths of the academy. Looking up at the signboard, Ning Kei knew that the old library was in that direction. Thinking of the earnest exhortations of the chief professor in the first class this morning, Ning Kei could not help but feel curious. He waved goodbye to Chu Yuxian and followed the crowd to that alley. The distribution of the buildings in the academy was irregular. There were a few areas in the east and a few corridors in the west. They were scattered among the meadow at the foot of the mountain, but it gave people a feeling of nature. There were countless hidden alleys between the study rooms with flat eaves and the corridors. It was quiet and secluded, extending in all directions. If there was no signboard, no one would know where it would lead. Ning Kei seemed to be joking, but deep down, he was not willing to follow the crowd. After a few steps, he deliberately separated himself from the crowd and walked quietly in the alley alone. The noon sun covered his head, casting a neat black shadow on the flat eaves beside the alley. It just happened to press on his right shoulder, which felt a little heavy. He walked quietly like this for a long time before he finally walked out of the alley. In front of him, there was suddenly a bright and open landscape. Ning Kei lifted the headscarf that was blown up by the wind to the back of his neck and looked at the large wetland forest in front of him. Looking at the lush water pines and green bamboos, he did not know that there was such a beautiful scenery in the depths of the academy. There were endless reeds growing in the swamp. At this time, there was no autumn wind to dye them yellow or white. Their upright wastes fluttered in the spring breeze, looking like a dense cornstalk field. The slightly dry wind passed through the forest by the swamp and was filtered by these green stalks that carried water vapor, becoming cool and pleasant again. Ning Kei walked on the stone path beside the wetland, looking at the fish in the shadow in the water and listening to the unknown insects chirping in the woods. His heart, which had been tense for more than 10 years, gradually loosened and softened, as if it was moistened by the water and gently rubbed by the shade of the trees. Occasionally, he passed by a classmate and nodded politely, but did not speed up his pace. The stone slabs under his feet had not been polished, and the uneven surface was just enough to prevent slipping. They were laid out from the alley of the study room, circled around the wetland, and then extended into the forest. About thousands of stones were densely packed together to form a flat road, forming an extremely long stone path. At the end of the path, they arrived in front of an old 3-story wooden building in the green forest at the foot of the mountain. The 3-story wooden building looked ordinary on the outside. It did not have any fancy decorations, nor did it have any curved eaves. It was simply built against the mountain, but the varnished wood should not be ordinary. Looking at the traces left by the wind and rain over the years, no one knew how long it had been standing in the depths of the academy, but there was no sign of decay. Ning Kei looked up at the horizontal plaque above the wooden building, with the words, "Old Library," written on it. He could not help thinking, are the instructors of the academy too lazy? How could a library be called Old Library just because it is old? I know you are all curious as to why this building is called Old Library. In fact, the reason is very simple. This building is responsible for collecting books for the academy, and books are only used to record our thoughts. Once thoughts jump out of the mind and are written on paper, they are no longer fresh, but just old things. Therefore, any book is an old book. There were already many people gathered downstairs. In front of the closed wooden door, a middle-aged instructor of the academy was smiling and explaining to the students the origin of the name Old Library. Now that you are all members of the academy, you must remember that in our academy, there is no such thing as cherishing words and paper, and there is no such rule as kowtowing on the table. Books are books, they are just tools, not sacred. Only our thoughts are fresh. In order to let you remember this, this building is called Old Library. The students nodded, but not all of them understood the hidden meaning of these two simple sentences. Ning Ke vaguely understood some of it, but he did not know if his understanding was completely correct. Let me tell you the rules of the old library. The middle-aged instructor in charge of managing the old library smiled and continued, there are a total of 2 instructors and 4 managers here. Our task is to serve all the teachers and students, so we work day and night. You can come and read at any time, but there are 3 things you must remember. First of all, the old library has the richest collection of books in the world. That is because there is an organization of 100 people in charge of searching for books in various countries, and your senior brother Li Jia also spends a lot of money to buy books. They work very hard and spend a lot of money. Therefore, when you read, please wash your hands. When you discuss, please do not spit on the books. You do not need to cherish them too much, but do not treat them as toilet paper in your own toilet. Secondly, it is impossible for us to find more books. Therefore, when you want to read a book but can't find it, please first question yourself whether the book you want to read is worth reading. If it is a novel, is it the most exquisite Hejian novel? If it is a novel about the Eastern Expedition, is it the most representative Big River? If it is not, then don't ask us again, because it means that we have judged the books you want to read to be meaningless. Finally, and most importantly, the old library is strictly prohibited from taking any books out, and copying is prohibited. Don't look at me like that, and don't try to instill any spirit of freedom and sharing in me. The rules of the academy are rules. Professor Chao Jifeng from Class C this morning must have taught you with his fists that the rationality of these rules is not to be questioned. As for the painstaking and earnest intentions behind these rules, you can unconditionally experience them and be inexplicably touched, but don't expect me to explain to you. The instructor stood under the horizontal plaque of the old library, smiling at the students with different expressions. His smile was extremely hateful, like a profiteer giving out loans, or a miser showing off his gold to tempt the poor. He said slowly, don't try to challenge the last rule. Even if you are the best book thief in the world, if you want to play tricks in the old library, there will only be one end, and that is death, a very miserable death. The students were in an uproar. Ning Ke stood outside the crowd and shook his head. He thought that even if the old library had the richest collection of books in the world, how could you remember if you were not allowed to copy or borrow? He had other doubts about the collection of books in the old library, but he thought that others would have the same doubts as him, so he suppressed his impatience and waited. As expected, a student raised his arm and asked loudly, "Sir, you said that there are all kinds of books in the old library?" The instructor shifted his gaze and found the student who dared to question him in the crowd. He frowned slightly and said unhappily, "Do you have doubts about what I said?" "I dare not." The student was frightened by the instructor's gaze and trembled slightly. He said, I'm just curious, is there that book about cultivation in the old library?" The instructor's expression became slightly better. He raised his chin and smiled slightly. He was so confident and arrogant that he could be pointed at by thousands of people. He said, in the eyes of the secular world, the so-called mysterious door books are probably extremely rare, but it is not difficult for the academy. If you want to read the legendary 7 volumes of tomes of arcane and lank Buddhist scriptures, the old library does not have them. But other than that, I really don't know what other cultivation books you can think of but can't find. Hearing this, Ning Ke, who stood outside the crowd, slowly clenched his fists in his sleeves. Although his expression did not change, his heartbeat sped up for no reason. He subconsciously raised his head and stared at the ordinary 3-story wooden building in front of him. His burning gaze seemed to want to ignite the wooden building. Entering the cultivation world had been his dream since he was young. Although he had been repeatedly defeated yesterday, the reason why the dream was beautiful was precisely because it was difficult to realize. But it also attracted him to try hard, and from time to time, he would show his little tail to tempt him and moan softly, "Come after me, come and catch me." He, who had long since given up hope of entering the cultivation world, suddenly found himself able to enter and exit a wooden building filled with cultivation books. For a young man who had spared no effort in traveling to several markets in the frontier fortress in order to buy a copy of the article on the response of the highest being, this was a sudden and indescribable happiness. Let me remind all of you not to look too greedy. Otherwise, if you really burn the old library down, the headmaster will cut all of us into peach branches and swallow us with wine. The instructor downstairs looked at Ning Kei, who was outside the crowd, with a faint smile. Then he stopped smiling and looked at the students with a serious expression. He said, I have to warn all of you that the mysterious books that you are curious about cannot be memorized. You can only experience them. As for the reason behind them, I will still not explain it. After all, human strength is limited. If you do not have the potential to cultivate, but still insist on entering the books, it will lead to some very bad results. When that happens, please do not complain that I did not warn you. The wooden door of the old library opened slowly. It was quiet inside, as if it was a door to an unknown world. There was no dust or cobwebs, but it gave people a sense of vicissitudes. The students outside the building were silent for a while. They tidied their clothes and calmed themselves down. Then, they stepped over the threshold and walked in. The inside of the building was much larger than it looked from the outside. There were many simple bookshelves neatly arranged in the spacious space. The bookshelves were arranged according to the 6 subjects and years. On them were all the books that one could think of. They were of different heights, old and new. They were all nestled together, as if countless sages and celebrities were naughtily looking at you side by side. The students quickly dispersed after entering the building, looking for the books that interested them. Ning Kei walked among the bookshelves alone, pulling out a book from time to time to read. Then, he found a writing table by the window of the library. There were writing brushes, ink, paper and inkstone on the table. He could not help but wonder why these things were prepared if they could not be copied. Ning Kei found a book of Wang Xinglong's regular calligraphy in the South Jin Kingdom Library. He took one out and read it as he walked. Gradually, it became quieter. He looked up and saw a clean staircase in front of him. The staircase was used to go upstairs. Now that he was on the first floor, above the staircase was the second floor. Chapter 84. Standing at the foot of the stairs, Ning Kei scratched his head and recalled the rules of the old library. It seemed that no student was forbidden to go up to the second floor. While he was hesitating, someone bypassed him and went up the stairs. Hearing the footsteps, Ning Kei felt relieved. He put the regular script of Wang Xinglong in the basket beside the pillar, picked up the front of his robe and went up the stairs. The second floor of the old library was quieter than the first floor, but there were fewer bookshelves and fewer books. Relatively speaking, the field of vision was wider. When he went upstairs, he found that there were already a lot of people upstairs. They were reading books in front of the bookshelves. Some of them were giggling, and some were murmuring. Apparently, they were all very excited. Most of the books on classics and history were on the first floor. The books on the second floor were mainly about martial arts and cultivation. Before entering the building, the instructor had already said that reading was not allowed. However, Ning Kei still felt that it was an unreal dream when he suddenly found a treasure mountain in front of him without any warning. He stood among the bookshelves in a daze and kept silent for a long time before he gradually digested the shock in his heart. Li Zhitang talks about Buddhism, the verified relationship between psyche power and emblematic gesture, brief introduction to the 5 states of cultivation, memories of West Hill, Dongxian Sutra, Nanhua Collection, summary of swordsmanship schools in South Jin Kingdom, dictionary of all arts appreciation. Walking in front of the bookshelves, his eyes fell on the densely packed spines of the books. The shock and excitement had long turned into confusion and helplessness. His hands and his sleeves were trembling uncontrollably. He didn't need to take out these books to read. He could guess the contents just by looking at the titles. That year, he had saved up money for a long time and went to Kaiping Market with the grain transportation team in the city of Wei. While looking for a doctor for Sang Sang, he searched all the bookstores in Kaiping Market like a stinky dog. Finally, he found the article on the response of the Tao. He read it for many years until it turned into ashes in a copper basin. That year, he killed 17 horse gangs on Shubi Lake and saved the firewood collecting team in the city of Wei. The general asked him, "What do you want?" "All the soldiers and civilians in the city of Wei can pool their money to find a popular prostitute for you." He held the article on the response of the Tao, which had been read thinly and thickly, and answered, "I want to learn cultivation." The general was speechless. The cultivator beside Min Mountain said that she couldn't do it. The officer in charge of the military ministry's assessment shook his head. Liu Qingchen heaved a long sigh. The teacher of the academy's course of magic skills patted him on the shoulder yesterday. He knew that there was a world in front of him, but he couldn't enter it. He told Sang Sang that it was okay, and that he could make a name for himself with his knife and arrows. But it was really not okay, because he didn't want to see the world in front of him vaguely, but he didn't know what was inside. It was not until he walked into the old library of the academy and went upstairs that he saw these densely packed books. He knew that it would be difficult for him to change the state of his body through these books, but at least he could see what that world looked like. For the past 16 years, he had struggled bitterly with the article on the response of the highest, like a poor child hugging his last potato. Today, he finally saw a vast expanse of paddy fields. Even though those paddy fields did not belong to him, he was very excited. Even his eyes became hot and wet. Sang Sang, he touched the spine of the book with his trembling fingers and read silently. At this moment, he just wanted to share his feelings with her. She was probably the only one in the world who could understand his feelings at this moment. The bookshelves were full of cultivation books. He had already determined his goals. Of course, books like Memories of West Hill were not books that he was in a hurry to read. Materials like South Jin Kingdom's swordsmanship school were also not things that he was qualified to study. He was not a person who set his sights too high. He knew very well that he could only start from the most basic things, such as the book in front of him, a preliminary exploration of Snow Mountain and Ocean of Qi. Just as he pulled out the extremely thin book, a muffled sound suddenly came from somewhere in the building. The students beside the bookshelves looked towards the source of the sound and saw a student fall to the ground. His face was as pale as snow, his body was twitching, and white foam was gushing out of the corner of his mouth. He looked extremely terrifying. 4 people in light-colored robes of the academy appeared out of nowhere and walked to the fainted student. They grabbed his hands and feet and exerted force at the same time. They lifted the poor student up like a chicken, and then quickly ran towards the stairs. Their actions were so skillful that it seemed that they had practiced it countless times. The students beside the bookshelves looked at each other and felt an inexplicable fear when they thought of the smiling instructor's warning before entering the old library. However, no one left. On the contrary, more and more students came up from downstairs. They were all young talents from all over the world. Like Ning Kei, they were extremely curious about the mysterious world and had strong confidence that they should be able to enter it. Therefore, they continued to silently lower their heads and took out books from the bookshelves to read silently, pretending that they knew nothing. Another heavy muffled sound of something falling to the ground was heard. Another young student fainted with a pale face. Ning Kei silently looked at the person who was quickly carried away. His heart became heavy and hesitant. But in the end, like the rest of his classmates, he could not resist the temptation of the new world. He made up his mind and opened the thin book in his hand. The first sentence of a preliminary exploration of Snow Mountain and Ocean of Qi was, "Heaven and earth have breath," which is called breath. Ning Kei nervously and attentively looked down the handwriting. Suddenly, he found that the handwriting in his eyes became blurred, as if someone had put a piece of frosted glass between his eyes. He knew that this was probably what the instructor had warned him about outside the building. He gently bit the tip of his tongue to force himself to stay awake and continue reading. Man is the spirit of all things. Therefore, he can understand the way of nature. Willpower is called psyche power. As he read, the handwriting in the thin book became blurred and gradually became a ball of ink stains. He desperately squinted his eyes, trying to make the words in his eyes clearer. Because he was too focused, his eyebrows began to hurt, and the blurred handwriting gradually floated away from the paper. Man's psyche power originates from the brain and converges between the snow mountain and ocean of chi. It condenses into frost, dew, and water. It flows through all the acupoints and disperses outside the body. It resonates with the breath of heaven and earth around the body. One by one, the blurred ink drifted away from the yellowish paper and entered his eyes and mind. It became wave after wave of impact, like a long oar poking into the sea beside a ship, constantly stirring his brain. Ning Ke did not feel any pain, but found that his body began to shake along with the stirring. His eyes became more and more blurred, and his chest felt stuffy and nauseous, as if he was extremely seasick. With a muffled groan, he forcibly closed the thin book in his hand and gasped a few times. Finally, he got rid of the mysterious dizziness. He took a few deep breaths and gradually recovered his calmness. A middle-aged woman in a professor's robe was sitting at the light table beside the window. Previously, no matter how many students fell down in the building, she seemed not to notice it and just concentrated on her small regular script on the table. However, after hearing the sound of the book being closed, she slightly frowned and looked up at Ning Ke, whose face was pale, with a touch of surprise flashing in her eyes. This female professor had been practicing in the old library for more than 20 years. She did not know how many new students of the academy were lost in books until they could not bear the mental impact and fainted. However, it was extremely rare to see someone like Ning Ke, who had already begun to read and could control his mind with a strong willpower to close the book again. Ning Ke did not know that he had attracted the attention of the female professor. At this time, all his attention was on the thin book in his hand. After he finished regulating his breath, he felt that his spirit and physical strength had returned to normal. Without hesitation, he opened the cover of the thin book again and continued to read. Just now, he saw the two words, mutual affinity, so he continued to read from there. However, this time, when his eyes fell on the two words, he suddenly felt that the two words floated into his mind and stirred up an extremely turbulent sea wave. With a boom, thousands of mountain-like waves came crashing over. The hand and the book in front of him disappeared. He stared blankly at the bookshelf gradually sinking and the densely arranged books in one place. Finally, he saw a snow-white roof, and then darkness, the darkness of the deepest part of the sea. A horse carriage stopped in front of the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street. The curtain was lifted and Ning Ke stepped out of the carriage. He bowed to the coachman and the deacon of the academy in the carriage and said very sincerely, "Thank you very much." As the horse carriage drove away, Ning Ke took a deep breath and rubbed his pale cheeks. He walked into the shop and looked at Sang Sang, who threw away the rag in her hand and looked at him with curiosity and hope. Ning Ke forced a smile and said, "The academy is really the best place in the world, but also the worst place in the world." He had fainted in the old library and did not wake up until the horse carriage was about to enter the Vermilion Bird Gate. He did not remember how he fainted at all. What made him feel more frightened and lost was that he even forgot the content of the book he was reading before he fainted. No matter how hard he tried, there was not a single memory in his mind. But I have to warn you, those mysterious books that you are curious about cannot be memorized. You can only experience them. As for the reason, I will not explain it. After all, human power is limited. If you do not have the potential for cultivation but force yourself into the books, it will lead to some very bad results. Now he finally understood the true meaning of the warning from the academy instructor in front of the old library. He even faintly guessed that those books on cultivation on the bookshelf should be written with some kind of talisman technique. There are many books on cultivation in the old library. I thought that you should be there. Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang and remembered the scene many years ago when he held a weak little girl like a mouse and ran to the bookstall in Linping Market. He said softly, "But it seems to be very troublesome to understand those books. It feels like there is a mountain in front of me. Young master, can't we go around it?" Sang Sang raised her little face and asked with concern. Ning Ke shook his head and looked at her quietly. He asked, "We have discussed before. What if we can't go around a mountain?" Sang Sang nodded hard and said, "Split the mountain." Chapter 85. The next day, the academy arranged a course of mathematics. However, the atmosphere in the study room today was somewhat different from yesterday. The students beside the desk listened silently to the professor's lecture, but their minds had already drifted elsewhere, to the place called the old library. Obviously, many people had experienced the same situation as Ning Ke yesterday. On the contrary, it aroused the unwillingness of these young students and their will to challenge. As the bell rang, the mathematics professor gently flicked his sleeves and announced the end of the class. The study room burst into an uproar and all the students rushed out, running towards the wooden building deep in the academy. The professor had seen the performance of the new students many times. He just smiled and shook his head, without saying anything. Chu Yuxian, who did not go to the old library yesterday, also wanted to explore it today after hearing about the magic of the building from his classmates. He called Ning Ke and rushed out. Ning Ke seemed to be very peaceful today and was not in a hurry at all. After walking out of the study room, he did not rush to the old library, but walked along the stone path to the kitchen. Ning Ke ate a chicken drumstick and 3 raw eggs for lunch for 2 people. He slowly finished all the food in front of him and looked up at the empty kitchen. He touched his slightly bulging abdomen with satisfaction. Walking out of the kitchen and stepping on the quiet stone path around the wetland reeds, he still did not rush to the old library. Instead, he walked slowly around the wetland lake 3 times until he was sure that the food in his belly had been digested and turned into the heat needed by his body. Then he squatted by the lake and carefully washed his hands before calmly walking in the direction of the old library. He did not have the potential for cultivation, but he had enough fighting experience. In the face of those mysterious books in the old library, he decided to fight with a resolute attitude and cut the mountain in front of him bit by bit. Therefore, he had to adjust his body and spirit to the best state. Make way. Make way. It's not boiling water. It's a living person. In front of the old library, there was a burst of hurried shouts. 4 deacons in school robes rushed out with a fainted student in their hands. Their faces were expressionless, but their shouts were particularly interesting. Probably because too many fainted students had been carried out in the past 2 days. They had to think of some ways to dispel this boring repetition. At least a dozen fainted students were lying outside the old library. The academy had long prepared for this situation, and there were instructors in charge of this matter treating them with refreshment soup and Jiyuan pills. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke could not help shaking his head with a bitter smile. Walking up the stairs, he found that among the empty bookshelves, there were fewer students than yesterday. But most of them were carried out, not because they were afraid of difficulties and did not want to go upstairs. Those who could enter the academy were all capable people. Who would be willing to give up on the second day? But looking at those young students' pale faces and swaying bodies as if they were drunk, Ning Ke was afraid that none of them could hold on for too long. From time to time, dull thuds could be heard, like the sound of ripe fruits falling onto the ground in autumn. The students beside the bookshelves kept falling down, either convulsing and fainting, or foaming at the mouth, looking at the sky listlessly. It was a very miserable sight. At this time, Ning Ke was still holding the book, A Preliminary Exploration of Snow Mountain and Ocean of Qi, in his hand. He withdrew his eyes from the unfortunate fainted classmates and did not have the time to pay attention to others. He took a deep breath and opened the book with a solemn expression. Heaven and earth have breath, it is called breath. The difficult climbing of the book mountain had to start from the first step, because he only remembered holding this book before he fainted yesterday, but did not remember what he had read and where he had read. He had foreseen in advance how helpless and repetitive the process of reading would be in the future, and every time he began, he would have to start from the first sentence. As expected, the handwriting on the thin book became blurred again. Those clusters of ink stains, like ink drops falling into the clear water urn, quickly dispersed. Ning Ke was unmoved and continued to read quickly. Man is the spirit of all things, so he can understand the way of nature. The willpower is the psyche power. The blurred handwriting once again drifted away from the paper and began to buzz and vibrate in his mind. Ning Ke felt that the vibration was not even like paddling, but more like the cold wind on the grassland. He felt that he was fighting with countless fierce horse gangs. He took a deep breath and forcibly raised his head to rest for a moment. Because the movement of raising his head was too firm and tough, his neck muscles were a little dull pain. In order to dispel the annoying feeling in his chest and abdomen at this time, he suppressed the infinite temptation of the thin book in his hand. He looked out of the window at the spring trees and other classmates beside the bookshelves. A small figure leaned against the bookshelf and collapsed weakly. It was Lin Xuan Wangying. Then Ning Ke noticed that in the deepest part of the bookshelf, Xia Qingyun was sitting on the ground with his legs crossed. He slightly lowered his eyes and quietly looked at the scroll on his knees. Although his eyes were still bright, his face was extremely pale. They are all trying hard to climb, Ning Ke said quietly. He was infected by the young, stubborn and unwilling atmosphere of his classmates in the building. He smiled and cast his eyes back to the paper. The psyche power of man originates from the brain and converges between the snow mountain and the ocean of qi. It condenses into frost, dew, and water. It flows through all the orifices and disperses outside the body. It resonates with the breath of heaven and earth around the body. The mass of ink floated again, shaking and swaying. Suddenly, he couldn't hear the buzzing sound in his mind. He felt as if he was standing in the streets of Spring Breeze Pavilion, without Chao Shao Shu by his side. There was only endless rain falling from the sky, hitting his face, body, and clothes. He suddenly felt extremely wet and cold. Then he fainted again. On the afternoon of the third day, outside the old library. Make way, it's not boiling water, it's a living person. 4 deacons in school robes carried the fainted Ning Ke out of the old library quickly and threw him to the doctor waiting outside. Then someone carried him into the carriage. Today, there were 27 people in a coma in the building. On the afternoon of the 4th day, outside the old library. Make way, it's not boiling water, it's a living person. It was still the same 4 deacons in school robes who carried the fainted Ning Ke out of the old library and threw him to the doctor waiting outside. They wiped the sweat on their foreheads and complained in a low voice. Today, there were 9 people in a coma in the building. On the afternoon of the 5th day, outside the old library. Make way, it's still the living person rolling in the boiling water. It was still the same 4 deacons in school robes who carried the fainted Ning Ke out of the old library slowly and weakly. The doctor waiting outside the building looked at this familiar face and could not help but sigh. Today, there were 4 people in a coma in the building. On the afternoon of the 6th day, outside the old library. Make way. The 4 deacons in school robes simply said 2 words and then threw Ning Ke into the shade outside the building. Spring was coming and the temperature was rising, but the academy students did not make any progress in challenging the old library and gradually failed miserably. In the following days, because of the unforgettable experience, most of the students had confirmed that the books in the old library were completely useless to them, and fewer people went to the 2nd floor. Every day after school, Ning Ke still insisted on going to the kitchen to have a big meal, take 3 laps around the wetland, and then continue to climb the stairs. Every time he climbed the stairs, he fainted and was carried away, but he was not discouraged at all. He did not give up, but his face became paler and paler, his cheeks became thinner and thinner, and his footsteps became more and more unstable. Seeing him go up the tall building and being carried out of the building, there was no accident. On this afternoon, Ning Ke ate 2 big plates of mushroom chicken rice, a plate of shredded pork belly with chili oil, and 2 steamed buns. He washed his hands by the wetland and went outside the old library again. The students of the academy did not remember that Ning Ke had gotten 3 A+ grades in the academy entrance exam. They only knew that this lad was the most famous lunatic in Class C. When he appeared at the entrance of the old library, all the students who were reading or taking notes by the window raised their heads at the same time. They looked at his figure and began to whisper among themselves. Is this guy crazy? How long will he stay upstairs today? An hour? I think he won't last long. He will be carried down in no more than 10 minutes. I'm more curious about who will go downstairs first, him or Mr. Xia. Mr. Xia has the potential for cultivation, but what about this guy? Why does he work so hard? I think it's because he wants to compete with Mr. Xia for the limelight. Otherwise, why would he work so hard? Ning Ke did not hear these whispers at all. He looked at the stairs in front of him, clutching his slightly trembling right wrist with his left hand. He forcibly suppressed the strong desire to take back his feet, took a deep breath and continued to go up. Only he himself knew that the stairs would be steeper, longer, and more difficult than yesterday every day. Looking at his back as he walked up the stairs with great difficulty, looking at his pale face, the gazes of the students downstairs became more and more complicated. Many people doubted his goal of risking his life, or looked down on his obsession, but no matter who it was, they couldn't help but admire the will and perseverance he displayed. On the second floor, Ning Ke gently wiped a few beads of sweat from his forehead and silently walked to the bookshelf where he stood every day. He pulled out the thin book that he had read for many days but still could not remember anything. There was silence on the empty floor. Apart from him, there was only one student who could still persist, Xia Qingyun, who sat at the end of the bookshelf with his legs crossed. His face was as pale as a new paper without ink, with the same book on his knees. Ning Ke knew that Mr. Xia was here. Since he could enter the course of magic skills, he must have the potential for cultivation, so he was not surprised that he could persist for such a long time. But he did not expect what kind of discussion would be caused in the academy when only he and Xia Qingyun were left on the second floor of the old library. In the eyes of many students and even instructors, Ning Ke and Xia Qingyun were competing again after the academy entrance exam. Neither of them was willing to give up before the other, so they came to the old library every day and struggled to persist. Ning Ke did not know this kind of discussion, nor did he know whether Xia Qingyun came here every day because of this competitive idea. Even if he knew these discussions, he would not care at all, because only he knew why he came here every day. Even if it was futile and extremely painful, he still wanted to come here every day. Because he liked it, because he needed it. The reason was so simple. Chapter 86. The thin primary exploration of Snow Mountain and Ocean of Qi was like a mountain pressing on his hand. He took a deep breath and turned his eyes to look out of the window for a long time. When the verdant treetops dyed his tired and dry eyes green, he lowered his head again and continued to read silently. After a while, he raised his head again and looked at the snow-white roof for a rest. In the beginning, when he was reading these magical cultivation books, he could only hold on for a few sentences. But now, he could hold on for a longer and longer time. Although he still didn't know what he was reading every day when he returned to Lin 47th Street, he had a very vague but clear feeling that he was reading more and more every day. The reason why he could hold on for a longer time was not that his resistance to the talisman and ink characters in the books was getting stronger and stronger, but his willpower was getting tougher and tougher in this war. Besides, he was constantly looking for a suitable time combination between rest and reading, looking for all the ways to hold on for a longer time. You'll die if you keep reading like this. The female professor who had been writing regular script in small regular script by the window slowly raised her head and put the elegant pen in her hand on the inkstone. She looked at Ning Ke, who was about to fall, and said in a gentle voice. Ning Ke slowly closed the book, turned around with difficulty, and made a deep bow to the female professor by the window. Xia Qingyun, who was at the end of the bookshelf, also slowly closed the book and politely nodded to the female professor. As the only two students who persisted on this floor, they certainly knew that there was always a female professor sitting by the window. However, it seemed that she was always writing regular script in small regular script. No matter if someone was in a coma or something else, she would never raise her head. So she gradually became a corner of the scenery and a non-existent existence. Today, the female professor finally put down her pen and began to speak. The cultivation books on this floor are all written by grand cultivators with psyche power. In other words, every ink character in these books is the best work of divine talisman masters. Looking at Xia Qingyun sitting cross-legged on the ground, the female professor said, "Both of you have great perseverance, and can even be said to be the most persevering students in the academy in the past 10 years. But you must know that perseverance is useless to see through the supreme products of divine talisman masters. You must have the ability of see-through upper class if you want to enter, break and understand the book." Then she turned to look at Ning Ke and said with a little pity, "Xia Qingyun has passed the state of perception and is about to enter the no-doubt state, so he can hold on for a longer time. What's more, what he has learned in the building will be good for his cultivation. But your physique is not suitable for cultivation at all. You can only rely on your willpower to hold on here, which will do you no good. It's better to go back early." Ning Ke stood where he was and kept silent for a long time. Suddenly, he bowed deeply to the female professor and asked sincerely, "May I ask if you are at the upper state of see-through?" The female professor shook her head. Ning Ke understood. He smiled gently and continued to ask, "May I ask if you had reached the upper state of see-through when you first entered the academy?" The female professor smiled and understood what he meant. Ning Ke bowed deeply to the ground again and said sincerely, "I want to continue to read for a few more days." The female professor looked at him with appreciation and said, "After all, you still have to act according to your ability. If you are stubborn, don't blame me for stopping you." "Yes, sir." Not long after this conversation, Ning Ke and Xia Qingyun fainted again one after another. The 4 deacons in academy robes had long been accustomed to this, and even knew their weight clearly. They picked them up expressionlessly and went downstairs without saying anything. The dense green of the forest in late spring penetrated through the window to the second floor of the old library. The female professor looked at the spring scenery outside the window and shook her head with a smile. Then she lowered her head and continued to write her regular script. Just then, the instructor of the old library came up from downstairs and came to her. He bowed very respectfully and said, "Teacher, I have one thing that I don't understand." The female professor looked at him and said gently, "I have also found some wonderful things that I don't understand recently. We might as well discuss them together." The instructor of the old library sighed and said, "I've been watching these 2 students for a few days. Xia Qingyun has the foundation of cultivation and extraordinary perseverance. It's not easy for him to stay upstairs for so many days, but it's not rare after all. But Ning Ke is obviously a mortal, so why can he stay for so long? It doesn't make sense." The female professor looked at the ink gradually stained on the tip of the elegant brush and said softly after a moment of silence, "I remember many years ago, the teacher once said that if a person's willpower is strong enough, then even God will be afraid. I think this child named Ning Ke is probably such a person with strong willpower." For the next few days, things seemed to be as usual. They attended classes in the morning, had lunch at noon, and went upstairs in the afternoon. Under the gaze of all the students and instructors of the academy, Ning Ke and Xia Qingyun went upstairs one after another and were carried out one after the other. Just when this situation seemed to become a daily scene, there was finally a new change. Ning Ke asked the instructor and found out that he could bring shell-free, oil-free and crumble-free food into the old library. So he brought a few pieces of white bread with him today. However, he was stopped by someone when he was about to enter the old library. "How long are you going to be angry?" Situilan held Jean Wuxia's little hand and looked at him angrily. Looking at his pale cheeks, she softened her heart and said in a low voice, "Now the whole academy knows that you are the most persevering students. Why do you still want to continue?" Ning Ke rubbed his sore eyes and looked at her inexplicably, as if he did not understand what she said. In fact, he did not understand. However, this expression was more like some kind of provocation in the eyes of the onlookers. Situilan said angrily, "Look at you now. You have dark circles and a pale face. You will be blown down by the wind, just like that Lecher Chu Yuxian." We all know that you can't cultivate like us. In this case, what's the point of you going upstairs? Why do you still have to fight with Xia Qingyun and continue to go upstairs? Chu Yuxian squeezed out of the crowd and held Ning Kei's left arm. He looked at Situ Ilan and raised his eyebrows, saying, Miss Situ, although you are the daughter of Yunhui General, some words can't be said. I am lecherous, but not a ghost. Then he turned to look at Ning Kei's pale cheeks and said with great sincerity and regret, but to be honest, I also advise you not to go upstairs. Why do you have to be angry? Even if you give up now, you, an ordinary person, have fought with the cultivation genius Xia Qingyun until now. Who wouldn't praise you? Ning Kei smiled and looked at the crowd in front of him. He said, I think you really misunderstood. I just want to go upstairs to read. It has nothing to do with being angry or fighting. I think Xia Qingyun also thinks so. You don't know what he thinks. Situ Ilan looked at him and said seriously, Xia Qingyun only has one purpose to enter the academy, and that is to enter the second floor. If he can't even compete with you, how can he have enough confidence to enter the real second floor? The second floor? Ning Kei frowned slightly and felt that he had heard this saying somewhere. He scratched his head and said, Don't Xia Qingyun and I read books on the second floor every day? You don't even know the second floor? Then why do you work so hard to go upstairs every day? Situ Ilan opened her eyes wide and looked at him as if she was looking at an immortal. She explained in surprise, the second floor of the academy is not the second floor of the old library. It is a very wonderful place. All the real sages have studied on the second floor. I heard that there are many supermundane sublime beings in it. What does it have to do with upstairs? Ning Kei pointed to the roof blankly. Because the door to the second floor is on the second floor of the old library. Situ Ilan said grumpily, I know it's a little hard to say, but you only need to know that it is very difficult to enter the second floor of the academy. I heard that only 7 or 8 people have entered in the past 10 years. Since you don't have this idea, why do you want to get involved with Xia Qingyun? Ning Kei looked at her and said with a smile, You mean, in order not to affect Xia Qingyun's cultivation and not to hurt his confidence to enter the second floor, you should ask me to give up voluntarily? As soon as these words were spoken, the surrounding crowd went silent because such a request didn't make sense no matter what, and it seemed to be extremely rude. Jean Wuxia, who had been standing silently beside Situ Ilan, bit her lower lip and broke away from her companion's hand. She walked to Ning Kei and bowed very seriously. She said in a slightly trembling voice, Student Ning, please help me. Xia Qingyun. Xia Qingyun vomited blood after returning home last night. He really can't hold on anymore. It was the first time that Ning Kei knew that the young man who went upstairs with him every day had paid such a heavy price for this. He fell into silence thinking of his vomiting every night and the concern on Sang Sang's little face. At this moment, Zhong Dajuan looked at him coldly and said, Do you need to beg this kind of person in a humble manner? I don't believe that an ordinary person can stay upstairs for so many days. When Qingyun was upstairs crying blood and reading every day, who knows what he was doing upstairs? Maybe he was just resting with his eyes closed. Xia Qingyun was a gifted scholar from the South Jin Kingdom. When he passed through Yangguan, he stayed in Zhong Dajuan's mansion. They were well known and appreciated each other, so they got along very well. Zhong Dajuan had already been extremely angry seeing his friend being forced to go upstairs by Ning Kei every day until he vomited blood last night. Of course, even he himself did not know the real reason that made him say such a malicious speculation was that he was unwilling to let all the academy's attention be taken away by the soldier from the border town. The malicious speculation seemed to be very consistent with the real situation, so the students looked at Ning Kei in a somewhat complicated way. At this moment, 2 carriages came along the stone path outside the building. Xia Qingyun, whose face was snow white, was helped to get off the carriage. He stared blankly at this side, but never said a word. Chapter 87. Seeing Xia Qingyun get off, Ning Kei noticed that this man obviously heard the discussion but didn't defend himself. He couldn't help feeling a little disappointed. He shook his head and didn't want to explain anymore. Looking at the crowd, he said, "If you think I'm a villain, then you should persuade Xie Qingyun not to go upstairs. Why do you have to be angry with me?" Seeing that he was not provoked by his words, Zhong Dajuan blocked in front of him with a gloomy face and said, "In any case, don't think about going upstairs again today." Ning Ke was slightly startled and then smiled. He lowered his head and slowly rolled up his sleeves, asking in a gentle voice, "Is the academy owned by your family?" "No." "Is the old library owned by your family?" "Also no." "Then can you beat me?" Then he looked at Zhong Dajuan and said, "Don't forget, I got A+ in archery and driving. If you insist on playing the role of a bad dog, don't blame me for beating you until you can't take care of yourself." Situilan, who was anxious before, could not help but laugh when she heard these strange words. Then she looked at the sad and reproachful expression of her female companion beside her and realized that her laughter was extremely inappropriate. She quickly lowered her head. Jean Wuxia's eyes were slightly wet. She looked at Ning Ke and said, "Zhong Dajuan was just trying to protect his friend. He really shouldn't have said those words. I apologize to you on his behalf. But, we really can't go upstairs anymore. What do you think? If you don't go upstairs, we will also persuade Xie Qingyun not to go upstairs again. Then we can consider it a tie." Situilan clapped her hands and praised, "This is a good idea. This is a good idea. It doesn't hurt the harmony at all." Looking at the two girls in front of him with a smile, Ning Ke couldn't help but think of some old memories of those fresh junior high school girls who were infatuated with him on campus and those silly girls who kept making plans for their female companions. He understood that these noble girls of Chang and were actually a group of innocent little girls. He said, "I have my reasons for going upstairs, which has nothing to do with fighting. If you really worry about Xie Qingyun's health, I suggest you to persuade him more." Jean Wuxia softly sobbed and said, "But Xie Qingyun has his pride. I can't persuade him." Ning Ke looked at her quietly. "I'm just a young soldier from the frontier fortress. I shouldn't have too much pride. So, instead of persuading him, you came to persuade me?" Jean Wuxia raised her head and wiped away the tears on her face with her sleeves. Then, she hurriedly apologized, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. It was a slip of the tongue. Please don't take it to heart. It doesn't matter." Ning Ke walked past the sobbing girl and went upstairs. He said, "I insist on going upstairs not because of pride, but because of something more important than pride." Situilan looked at his back in astonishment and asked in confusion, "Is there anything more important than pride?" Ning Ke did not answer her. He thought to himself that some things were more important than pride, such as life and death. "Ning Ke, you have to think about the consequences of going upstairs today," Zhong Dajuan said coldly behind him. He had also noticed Xie Qingyun's arrival. Since Xie Qingyun kept silent, he thought he knew what to do, so his voice became harsher. "Haotian has given its people everything. All you need to do is accept it. At this time, there are so many people here. Most of them can't cultivate, but we are not like you who are unwilling to give up and even jealous. I know very well what you want to do. You know you can't enter the second floor, so you use some evil tricks to make Qingyun unable to enter the second floor. But have you ever thought about how sinister and shameful it is to harm others without benefiting yourself?" Hearing the term, second floor, again, Ning Ke finally remembered that Liu Qingchen and the great sword master assassin had mentioned it in the fight at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. He could not help but stiffen slightly. A mere abandoned disciple of the academy became a great sword master of see-through state after learning on the second floor for a few days. The second floor of the academy, what kind of place was it? His silence and his slightly stiff body gave a wrong signal to the students in the building. They thought that Zhong Dajuan had hit the nail on the head and exposed his intention, so he was embarrassed and in the wrong. Just as the discussion gradually started, Ning Ke slowly turned around at the entrance of the stairs, with a trace of strong sarcasm on his pale and thin face. He looked around at the crowd and said, I didn't know what kind of shabby place the second floor was before, so I didn't want to enter it. Now that I know what kind of shabby place it is, I will definitely enter it. I hope no one among you will be surprised at that time. Zhong Dajuan was so angry that he laughed coldly and said, "You still don't admit that you are jealous of Mr. Xie?" There were 2 carriages parked outside the old library. One of them sent Xie Qingyun, who vomited blood last night and asked for morning leave, to the front of the building. The other one was an ordinary carriage with indigo curtains, but no one got off and the curtain was still. At this moment, a cold voice suddenly sounded in the carriage with indigo curtains. "I only know that the flowers in the greenhouse will be jealous of the high cliff snow lotus, but I never know that the goshawk in the sky will be jealous of the chickens on the ground." The voice was not so harsh, nor did it carry a strong sense of sarcasm, but it directly made the students inside and outside the old library silent. Zhong Dajuan's expression was extremely ugly, and Xie Qingyun's snow-white face even faintly showed a trace of irrepressible shame and anger. Because the words spoken by the person in the carriage not only raised Xie Qingyun to a very high position, as a snow lotus on the high cliff and a soaring eagle in the sky, but also directly regarded Xie Qingyun, the well-known talent of the aristocratic family in the South Jin Kingdom, as a flower in the greenhouse that had not been weathered by wind and rain, and those chickens pecking on the ground all day long. A simple sentence returned all the previous sarcasm to Ning Ke with countless times of strength. Everyone was shocked and looked at the carriage, wondering who dared to ridicule Zhong Dajuan of Yangguan and Xie Qingyun of the South Jin Kingdom. Just when Zhong Dajuan was ready to ridicule back and some people were ready to speak angrily, the person in the carriage with indigo curtains continued to speak indifferently, aiming at the 2 noble ladies of Cheng, and who were inexplicably nervous at the moment. Since his skills and perseverance are not as good as others, then he should sharpen himself well and seek the final victory. How can he let a woman plead for him? Wuxia, you have been a smart and sensitive girl since childhood. How can you become so stupid these years? And Ilan, you even helped the people of the South Jin Kingdom to ridicule the Tangs. Where is the strength that you used to ride a horse on the street when you were a child, crying and holding your father to go on an expedition to the South Jin Kingdom? Strength is not proved by ridicule. Our Tang Empire relies on swords and arrows after all. Go back and reflect on yourself. The person first ridiculed Xie Qingyun of the South Jin Kingdom, and then severely reprimanded the 2 noble ladies of Chang'an. His tone was calm, but there was an irresistible strength in it. Especially after being reprimanded, Sidu Ilan and Jin Wuxia did not show any anger, but lowered their heads in shame. The students inside and outside the old library felt that something was wrong and could not help but be curious about who was in the carriage with indigo curtains. The voice in the carriage with indigo curtains sounded again, "Ning Ke, come here." There was dead silence inside and outside the old library, especially when Situ Ilan's cautious eyes confirmed the identity of the woman in the carriage with indigo curtains. They subconsciously bowed to salute. Zhong Dajuan's face became extremely ugly, not because of anger, but because of fear. Although he was born in a big family in Yangguan, as long as the person in the carriage with indigo curtains said something casually, he was afraid that his future career would be terminated. Xie Qingyun's cheeks were whiter than before. Although he was not a Tang's and did not have Zhong Dajuan's worries, as a person of the South Jin Kingdom, how dare he provoke the person in the carriage? According to the etiquette of the Tang Empire, only the Empress Dowager or the Empress could call themselves the Empress. If there was an elder princess in the imperial court, she could also call herself the Empress. But there was no Empress Dowager or elder princess in the Tianqi dynasty, so the only one who could call herself the Empress was the Empress. But it was impossible for the Empress to come to the academy in a carriage. So there was only one possibility. In the Tianqi era, there was a princess who was specially allowed by the imperial court to call herself the princess because of her virtue. In the carriage with indigo curtains sat the most beloved 4th princess of the Tang Empire, the most respected 4th princess of the Tang Empire, and the idol of young men and women of the Tang Empire. Who dared to offend her? Ning Ke was slightly surprised. Under the strange gaze of the students, he walked out of the old library and slowly walked to the carriage with indigo curtains. Only then did he notice that the groom wearing a bamboo hat was Peng Yutao. Peng Yutao smiled and nodded, saying, "Her Highness wants to talk to you." Ning Ke smiled and nodded. He walked to the side of the carriage and bowed slightly, saying calmly, "Your Highness." Li Yu lifted a corner of the curtain and quietly looked at the lad whom she had not seen for a long time. She suddenly said, "Since you have entered the academy, you can call yourself a student when you see me from now on." Ning Ke looked at the beautiful and pleasant face through the corner of the curtain. He did not know why he suddenly thought of the bonfire at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. He smiled and lowered his voice, saying, "Since you are not a teacher of the academy, why should I be your student?" Li Yu was slightly stunned. She did not expect that this naughty lad would still be so naughty even after she had regained her dignity as a princess. She could not help but slam the curtain heavily and said coldly, "I came to the academy for some business today. I thought that you were studying in the academy, so I came to visit an old friend. I mainly wanted to tell you that I miss Sang. Tomorrow, bring her to the princess mansion for me to see." At this time, separated by the cyan curtain, Ning Ke could not see the face of the maidservant, which reminded him of the maidservant at that time. Ning Ke became much calmer and more normal. He bowed respectfully and said softly, "Your Highness is considerate." The curtain was lifted again. Li Yu quietly looked at his pale cheeks through the gap and slightly frowned. After a moment of silence, she said, "I heard that you go upstairs every day these days. I advise you to take care of your body. Don't lose your life in a fit of pique. Why do you have to be angry with these people? Saving your life to serve the country is the right way." Ning Ke straightened up and was about to explain, but he did not expect the indigo curtain carriage to leave. Chapter 88. The carriage with the indigo curtain slowly moved away along the stone path by the wetland. The seemingly flat slate was uneven, so the soles of the shoes would not slip easily, but the hard wheels would be violently shaken. In the carriage, Li Yu, the fourth princess of the Tang Empire, was in a daze, holding her chin. She was a little annoyed, so she increasingly felt that Ning Ke was very annoying. She came to the academy today for nothing else but to see Ning Quebec. She wanted to see how the lad who had accompanied her back from the grassland had become. She wanted to know what was so special about the guy who had refused her recruitment, but had followed old Chow from the Spring Breeze Pavilion to kill on a rainy night and caught the attention of Su Chongshan. The most direct reason was that 2 freshmen in the academy had entered the second floor of the old library for more than 10 days in a row. This strange thing had spread out of the academy and reached her ears. When she knew that one of the freshmen was Ning Ke and thought of Liu Qingshan's evaluation, she could no longer suppress her curiosity and decided to come and have a look. At first glance, it was still that ordinary, but childish and clean face. There were still a few freckles and shallow dimples, but his face was much paler than before and looked extremely unhealthy. She did not know why, looking at Ning Ke's pale face and the stubborn and sarcastic expression on his face, she was a little annoyed. If it were not for Zhong Dajuan's sarcasm, which irritated her, perhaps she would not have asked him to come. Ning Ke walked into the old library, and the eyes of the surrounding students were completely different from before. They were full of shock and confusion. Everyone thought silently in their hearts, could it be that the record on the academy's roster is wrong? This person is not a soldier from the city of Wei, but a disciple of a big family in Qinghe Prefecture as the original legend says? If not, how could the fourth princess know him and even specially summon him to the carriage for a few words? Situilan slightly tilted her head and curiously looked at him, probably also guessing the relationship between him and the princess. Jean Wuxia hid half of her body behind Situilan and was a little ashamed to look at him. Princess Li Yu had personally ridiculed Ning Ke, who dared to continue to question him. The embarrassed Zhong Dajuan had hidden somewhere at this time, while Xie Qingyun stood outside the crowd with a pale face, looking a little lonely. Chu Yuxian walked to Ning Ke's side and looked at him in surprise. He said in a low voice, "No wonder Mistress Jian didn't want to take your money. I didn't expect you to have such a strong background." According to the temperament of Situilan and the other girls, even if you bring out the prince today, it may not work. Only the fourth princess can deal with them. Upon hearing this, Ning Ke became interested and asked, "What's the reason?" Chu Yuxian laughed and said, "The reason is simple. The so-called Chang, an army of women, was originally created by the fourth princess when she was bored. Noble ladies like Situ and the others were all brought up by the princess." Ning Ke smiled and did not explain the relationship between him and Princess Liu. He did not have the thought of using the tiger's skin to make a coat, but he was willing to make this relationship even more ambiguous. Seeing Ning Ke walking to the second floor, Xia Qingyan finally moved. He slowly walked into the building, ignoring the obstruction of the people around him. He held the railing with his hands, and his body kept shaking, moving up step by step with difficulty. Ning Ke held the thin book, a preliminary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow, but did not open it. After Xia Qingyan walked past him to the deepest part of the bookshelf and sat down cross-legged as usual, he suddenly said, "You may have your pride, but I also have my own needs. You're the god's favored one, while I'm just a desperado who wants to live. There's a big difference between the two. I suggest you don't lose your life in order to compete with me for a short time." When Xia Qingyan walked past him, he saw the book in Ning Ke's hands tightly closed. He thought that Ning Ke was angry at his previous silence downstairs, so he wanted to continue to gamble with his life. But he did not expect that Ning Ke would say such words. The gifted scholar from the South Jin Kingdom, who had been intelligent since childhood, kept silent for a long time and stared blankly at the pages on his knees. No one knew what he was thinking. Then he stood up with difficulty by holding the wall, made a deep bow, and slowly walked downstairs. The deepest part of the bookshelf was close to the west window, where the sun could be seen in the afternoon. Ning Ke walked there with the thin book and sat down in the warm sunset. He sat down cross-legged on the floor where Xia Qingyan had sat for many days. After closing his eyes for a long time, he gently rubbed his pale and thin cheeks, opened the book with a smile and continued to read. "You can make some notes. Although they can't be copied or taken away, they may be helpful." The female professor in a light-colored robe was standing beside the new branches of an old tree by the east window. She did not even raise her head. She was concentrating on her small regular script. If Ning Ke had not confirmed that he had heard her, he would have suspected that she had not spoken. He was slightly startled and stood up. He walked to the table beside the west window and looked at the writing brush, ink, paper, and inkstone on the table. He sat down after thinking for a long time. He picked up the ink block with his fingers and began to grind it in the clear water. The books in the building were strictly forbidden to copy. Even if you wanted to filter the divine talisman characters on those cultivation books in your mind and copy them on the white paper, it was not feasible. Ning Ke tried to meditate, when the fragments of memories flashing through his mind were turned into characters and left on the white paper. The characters in his mind would disperse like smoke and could not appear at all. And according to the rules of the old library, no traces could be left on the books. Ning Ke did not know whether the instructor would find out if he played tricks on the books. But he had never tried to play this kind of trick these days. Countless battles of life and death over the years had long made him understand that in the face of the mountains that had to be crossed, any trick would be very stupid. At that time and place, what you needed was the kind of great wisdom that was close to foolishness. What should I write? In this case, what kind of words could be considered as notes? Ning Ke held the writing brush for a long time, but he could not write anything on the paper. Because he had forgotten what he had read in the thin book before, he did not know what to write on the paper at this time. Maybe these things that I have been doing with my life are meaningless in themselves? He smiled slightly self-mockingly. Thinking of the hard work these days, the painful tossing and turning every night, and Sang applying a hot towel to his forehead every night, he inevitably felt a little sad and lost. It was really so difficult for an ordinary person to step into the world of cultivation. No matter how hard you tried, it seemed that failure would only make it more tragic. With a light paw sound, the brush that was full of ink hovered in the air for too long. A drop of ink dripped down and landed on the snow-white paper. The ink quickly spread along the fibers of the paper, blossoming into a ball of irregular beauty. Ning Ke lowered his head and looked at the ink stain. Suddenly, his heart fluttered. The sadness and disappointment in the deepest part of his heart were washed away and turned into absolute calmness. At this moment, he understood everything. Not every love story had a beautiful memory, not every fairy tale had a happy ending, and not all efforts would be rewarded. Even if he tried his best, it was difficult to decide what he would get in the end. Then, he should just enjoy the process. If the writing brush could not write down any profound words, then there was no need to write them down. If he did not know what to write, then he would write something else, such as his mood, his own experience, his feeling in the building, the picture of the quiet female professor by the east window, the old tree with new branches, the sunset by the west window, the momentary afterglow when the candle was cut off, a higher floor, a higher floor. All the previous worries are over now. I was originally a woodchopping lad by the Shubi Lake. Why should I imitate others to say that the weather is cold? You should know that it is not autumn yet. He picked up the brush and began to write casually on the paper. He didn't have any specific thoughts in mind. He was just writing according to his thoughts at this moment. As the tip of the brush wrote clear and beautiful words on the paper, the feeling of extreme annoyance in his chest seemed to be gradually erased by the brush, disappearing without a trace. I have been in the building for 17 days. I have practiced hard every day, but I could not cultivate the words into my heart. I could only watch them slip away. I have been sober and have fallen into a dark and sweet dream for no reason, but they are always not there. If they are illusory on the paper, why can I see them? If they are real, why can't I remember them? If they exist between reality and illusory, is the ink that wrote them real or illusory? Is the paper that carries them real or illusory? Since he was just casually expressing his mood, Ning Ke suddenly did not want to write anymore. So he put down the brush and looked at the words on the paper quietly. When the paper was dry, he gently put it into the thin book and put the book back on the bookshelf. He turned around and bowed respectfully to the female professor by the east window before walking downstairs. For the first time in many days, he walked downstairs by himself instead of being carried downstairs. The female professor looked up at the young man's somewhat disappointed back and sighed softly. She silently thought of the rules set by her teacher in the old library. Among thousands of trees and thousands of sails, students were only allowed to choose one branch and one wind. Although this student was strong-willed and the psyche power accumulated in meditation was not weak, his snow mountain and ocean of chi acupoints were blocked. In the end, he could only end up vomiting blood and lying in bed weakly. Even if Haotian pitted his tenacity and granted him health, what was the use of watching him like this for another 80 years? The dusk gradually deepened and the night was coming. No one else went up to the second floor. The female professor packed up the ink, paper and inkstone in front of her and walked along a side path in the building toward the back of the mountain. After a long time, the academy and the mountain behind the academy were shrouded in darkness. The academy buildings in the wide meadow were lit up and scattered everywhere like stars in the sky. In the depths of the silent second floor of the old library, a few strands of intricate carvings on the bookshelf against the north wall suddenly brightened for a moment and then slowly slid to the side silently. A fat young student in a dark cyan academy robe squeezed out from the gap, panting. He angrily looked back at the bookshelf and complained, "I don't know who designed this thing. Didn't they know to make the exit bigger? Didn't they think that the academy would also recruit a few fatties?" The fat lad mumbled to the bookshelf and mumbled, "Second brother is a bad guy." He insisted on using the entry-level books as a bet. Although I, Chen Pippi, am a rare genius, how can I still remember the things I read when I was young? Talking to himself, he pulled out a thin book from the bookshelf and looked at the words, "A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Chi and Mountain of Snow," on the cover. With satisfaction, he gently patted it. As he patted, a very thin white paper flew out. Chapter 89. Looking at the white paper at his feet, the fat lad named Chinpipi was slightly startled. His eyes, which were as thin as grains of rice, quickly rolled a few times, and his cheeks, which were like steamed buns, squeezed out 2 wrinkles with great difficulty to express his doubts at the moment. Then he thought for a long time and finally made a very difficult decision. He painfully squatted down his fat body, stretched out his short and cute right hand, and struggled to pick up the paper. Then he took a few deep breaths. Being a fat man is really the most pitiful thing in the world. Chinpipi's smooth and tender thick lips trembled, and then he lowered his head to look at the handwriting on the paper, and subconsciously read out, "A few floors higher, and a few floors higher. All the previous worries are now over. I was originally a woodchopping lad by the Shubi Lake. Why should I imitate others to say that it's cold? You should know that it's not autumn yet. Being a fat man is not the most pitiful thing in the world, if this fat man is a genius fat man." He pitifully looked at the handwriting on the paper, and guessed that it must be the painful self-narration of a new student of the academy. He shook his head and sympathetically said, "Compared with a genius like me, an ordinary person like you is really pitiful. The world of mortals and geniuses could never be interconnected." Chinpipi could understand the poor guy's distress and despair, but he did not intend to treat the guy's pain as his own. He casually commented on the poor guy, and then put the thin paper back on the bookshelf. He held the book he wanted, a preliminary exploration of Ocean of Chi and Mountain of Snow, and was ready to leave. Suddenly, he turned around and took out the thin piece of paper again. Looking at the densely packed handwriting on it, his thick eyebrows raised a little on his smooth and plump forehead. He said in surprise, "This guy's handwriting is pretty good." After praising him, he put the paper back on the bookshelf and was ready to leave again. He turned around again, took out the thin paper again, and looked at it carefully for a long time. Then he praised, "It's not bad, it's very good." Chinpipi found that his behavior at this moment was somewhat abnormal and ridiculous. He opened his mouth slightly and looked at the feelings left by the poor guy on the paper. He muttered to himself, "Could it be that even Master Haotian feels that you are too pitiful, so he wants to use this good writing to persuade me to help a poor person like you?" Sometimes, people just needed an excuse to make a decision, even if it was a made-up excuse. Tonight, Chinpipi didn't know what he was going to do next would change someone's life in some sense. He just wanted to do something, so he did it. From this point of view, he was indeed more carefree than some poor person. Chinpipi walked to the desk by the east window and sat down. With the help of the starlight, Chinpipi looked at the poor man's next words with great interest. His fat fingers tapped on the window from time to time, and there were nocturnal birds singing outside. "I've been in the building for 17 days, and I've been practicing hard every day, but I can't get the words to enter my heart. I can only watch them slip away. I've been awake before, and I've fallen into a dark and sweet dream for no reason, but they're always gone. If they're illusory on paper, why can I see them? If they're real, why can't I remember them? If they exist between reality and illusory, then is the ink that they're written on real or illusory? Is the paper that carries them real or illusory?" After reading these words, Chinpipi pouted, and his fat face was full of disapproval. He was like a boy who had eaten countless bowls of authentic Zhongshan Road hot and dry noodles in West City, and saw a poor guy who didn't know how to stir the improved spicy sauce noodles with a frown. Chinpipi felt proud and conceited from the bottom of his heart. Chinpipi grinded the ink under the dim light of the night, and the starlight shone into the ink. He used his fat fingers to grab the delicate and fine brush that his senior sister used to use, and wrote a long explanation on the back of the thin paper. Unlike his fat body, the tiny characters on the paper were actually delicate and meticulous to the extreme. "Poor guy, don't believe in the nonsense of seeing a mountain is not a mountain, but seeing a mountain is still a mountain. If Lord Haotian has nothing to do all day and gives us these questions, wouldn't it be too boring? Of course, the things that exist objectively are real. For example, the handwriting on this book is more real than my pride and conceit at this time. Although the divine talisman master has tampered with the handwriting, you have to believe that it's real. If you can't believe it yourself, then your eyes naturally won't believe it. The handwriting is objective and real, and the paper is also objective and real. But when the paper and the handwriting reflect the spring sunshine outside the window and into your eyes, which are not sure whether big or small, and then it's understood by your brain, which is not sure whether you're smart or muddle-headed. I guess muddle-headed, then it becomes an illusory existence. The spring sunshine reflected on the paper is already an explanation. When you see it with your eyes, it's another explanation. When you try to understand it, it's another explanation. Explanations are often misunderstandings. The more you explain, the more things will be different from the original appearance. If you still can't understand it, then I have to use the crudest example. The objective reality of things is like a naked beauty, which can only be accepted, and doesn't need to be understood by you and me. Just like that naked beauty, no matter whether her breasts are big or small, whether her buttocks are round or perky, whether the hair under her lower abdomen is thick or thin, it's all objective reality, and you can't change her. But when you look at her lecherously, think how beautiful she is, and want to sleep with her, these thoughts will become pieces of clothes. Every time you think about it and try to understand it, you will put a piece of clothes on her charming and beautiful body, until finally you have forgotten what she looked like at the beginning, and how big her breasts were. How to solve this problem? It's very simple. Remembering the moment when he first saw her naked, no matter if she was the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hong Yu of the Westhill Divine Palace, he directly went up to her and simply and violently fucked her, regardless of whether she was the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hong Yu of the Westhill Divine Palace. Women are meant to be fucked. It's not for you to understand. The brush and ink were written directly in his mind. Chin Pippi threw the book on the ground, and his face was full of spirit and satisfaction. He had been regarded as a rare genius since he was a child. However, after many years of learning from the wise and virtuous sages, he could only listen to them obediently, and never had the chance to teach others so unscrupulously. He praised himself, although the words are vulgar, the truth is not. I only hope that you won't be driven into chi deviation by these words. When the ink was dried by the night wind outside the east window, he proudly stood up and swaggered back to the bookshelf, the fat on his face trembling. He put the paper back into the primary exploration of the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, and didn't care about the bet between him and second brother on the basic teaching materials tonight. Just as he was about to put the thin book back into the recycling shelf, a trace of hesitation flashed across his fat face. He thought that he had seriously violated the rules of the old library by helping the poor guy. However, then he thought of another sentence that the teacher had said, and his eyes that were as small as mung beans rolled, and then he put the book into the recycling shelf, and then swung his sleeves and walked away. Rules are just a fart. Ning Kei set off from the Lin 47th Street every day before dawn, and returned to Chang and City late at night. Although today was the first time that he had ever walked out of the old library, the night had become extremely dark when the carriage entered the south gate of Chang'an. Chu Yuxian was worried about his health, and specially waited for him to go back to the city today. When the two carriages stopped at the door of the old brush pen shop, the son of a rich family in the eastern city stuck his head out of the second carriage, and looked at Ning Kei who was walking into the shop. He said with admiration, "Ning Kei, I really didn't expect you to be so open-minded and generous, repaying evil with kindness, elegant and noble." Ning Kei stood at the door of the old brush pen shop and turned around to look at him with a smile. He said, "Although I'd like to continue listening to you and see how many good words you can think of to compliment me, I have to be honest. I didn't persuade young Master Xia to go downstairs because I was worried about his health. I just liked the place where he sat cross-legged every day, and that place could bask in the sun. You're doing a good deed, but you don't like to be complimented. You have to find a dirty reason." Chu Yuxian scolded him with a smile, and then ordered the servant to drive the carriage away from the Lin 47th Street. Ning Kei smiled and waved his sleeves to drive them away. Then he walked into the shop, took the towel from Sang Sang, and covered his face with it. Then he collapsed in the armchair, as if all his bones and strength had been sucked out. Since he started to go upstairs, every night when he returned to the Lin 47th Street, there would be a hot towel to help him recover. Sang Sang calculated the time of his return very accurately, and then soaked the towel with boiling water to ensure that the temperature was good. Under the steaming white towel, Ning Kei's tired voice came out, "I still don't have a good appetite today, so I'll make a bowl of noodles with fried eggs." Sang Sang softly agreed, but did not leave. She stood quietly beside the round chair, and looked at the towel and steam on Ning Kei's face. After a long silence, she suddenly said, "Young master, tomorrow, don't go." Although Ning Kei could still talk with others in the academy, and could even tell a few naughty jokes with Chu Yuxian, only he and Sang Sang knew how much damage he had done to his body and spirit. Every day when he returned to the city from the academy, he was in so much pain and weak that he did not even have the strength to speak. Because of the severe vomiting, he had to use a lot of willpower to swallow his dinner every night. Hearing Sang Sang's voice, Ning Kei looked at the white velvet forest in front of him, and felt the spicy heat and humidity between his mouth and nose. After a long silence, he forced a relaxed smile and said, "I didn't take you out to play in the academy a few days ago, so tomorrow I won't go to the academy." "Oh yes, I met that idiot princess in the academy today, and she wants you to play. Let's go tomorrow." Sang Sang removed the warm towel from his face, and stretched out her small hand to massage between his eyebrows. She smiled shyly and said, "Her Highness wants to see me? I like it too." Ning Kei closed his eyes and felt the annoyance between his eyebrows being driven away by her cold and slender fingertips. He sighed comfortably and said, "Let's take this opportunity to cross off the second name tomorrow." Sang Sang's fingertips on his eyebrows slightly stiffened, and she gently lowered her head to look at her slightly worn embroidered shoes. It seemed that she did not like this matter very much. Chapter 90. Ning Kei decided not to go upstairs to read for a day. Instead, he would take Sang Sang to visit the princess and kill someone along the way. Sang Sang didn't really like this decision. It was not because she didn't like killing people. She had seen Ning Kei kill too many people since she was a child. She didn't feel anything about it. She just didn't like that Ning Kei still refused to rest for a day in such a physical condition. Although the little handmaiden was in a bad mood, the noodles with fried eggs were still delicious. The reason why Ning Kei didn't put pepper or green onions in the noodles was not because of punishment, but because he often felt nauseous and vomited these days. His stomach and intestines couldn't bear the spicy seasonings, so he had to eat something light. After eating the noodles with fried eggs, Ning Kei washed his feet with hot water until they were almost red. Then he comfortably fell onto the bed. Sang Sang washed her little feet with the remaining water, then poured out the foot-washing water and climbed onto the bed. She separated her slender legs and rode on his waist, beginning to massage and soothe his mind. After confirming that he had fallen asleep, Sang Sang gently sighed and raised her right arm to wipe the non-existent sweat on her forehead. She knelt to the other side of the bed, got into her own quilt, and fell asleep with her face against the powder box of Chenjinji Cosmetics store. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by Ning Kei's painful moaning and rolling. She rolled out of the quilt and got out of bed. Stepping on her old shoes, she skillfully used the tip of her toes to pull out the copper basin under the bed. Then she sat beside Ning Kei and patted his back with her small hands, sometimes rubbing him from top to bottom. Ning Kei lay on the bed with a pale face. He stretched half of his body out and kept retching toward the copper basin below. His eyebrows and eyes were twisted together, showing that he was in great pain. The food he had eaten before had passed through his stomach and intestines, so he vomited the 2 cups of hot tea he drank before going to bed, as well as some gastric juices and bile. Since he began to read books in the academy, he had been tortured like this several times every night. It not only made his body weaker, but also made Sang Sang extremely tired during the day. Every time he fell asleep, the ink characters that he read in the old library during the day would turn into a thick, dark monster, emerging from the deepest part of his mind. Wielding spears and swords, the monsters would swell up rapidly and converge into a big ship, constantly surging in his mind. The blue sea was surging with stormy waves, making him extremely dizzy. His chest and abdomen were filled with disgust, and he had a strong urge to vomit. It seemed like a nightmare, but Ning-Ke was very clear that it was not a dream. It was just the aftermath of the surging interaction between the characters written by the divine talisman masters on the second floor of the old library and his spiritual world, in a mysterious way. Enduring this torture every night, if he could remember those ink characters, it would be a reward for his efforts. However, what made him feel extremely disappointed and even infuriated was that when those ink characters were wreaking havoc in his mind, it was as if he was suffering from aphasia and word recognition disorder. He clearly saw those ink characters appear clearly in front of him, and they looked so familiar, but no matter how he opened his mouth, he could not read them, and he could not recognize what they were. Every day in the old library, he painfully read books that he could not understand, and every night in the old brush pen shop, he felt dizzy and uncomfortable looking at the characters that he could not recognize. It was not just one day, but many days. If it was someone with a slightly weaker willpower, he might have already given up. But for Ning-Ke, this kind of inhuman pain and torture was the best opportunity he could find in his 16 years of life. Unless there was no hope in the end, he would never give up. There was a saying that the person who understood you the most was your enemy. This saying was not wrong. In this world, the person who understood General Xiahou the most was definitely Ning Quebec. However, this saying was not complete, because no matter how one thought about it, the person who understood you the most was still you. Ning-Ke knew himself very well, so he knew that he would never turn back until he was at the end of his rope. He was not worried that his life would be in danger. The female professor had been sitting quietly by the east window. He knew that if there were no accidents, he would insist on going upstairs and reading until his body became weaker and weaker. Therefore, he had to make the most of his time and cross off as many names as he could from the list. The second name on the oil paper was Chen Zixian, the former deputy general of the Xianwei General. As the most favored princess by the emperor, Li Yu lived in the imperial city all year round, but she also had her own mansion in Chang'an. The next day, Ning-Ke and Sang were led to the princess mansion in a secluded place in the southern city. Today, she was wearing a red and black short skirt. The middle skirt was embroidered with beautiful large and strange flowers. Coupled with the deep collar, the skirt had a slightly mountainous feel to it that hung down to the back of her feet, making her look luxurious and extraordinary. "Where is Ning-Ke?" Only Sang walked into the back of the princess mansion. Li Yu slightly frowned and looked at the little handmaiden who was brought in by the eunuch. Then she smiled and walked forward to hold Sang-Sang's slightly cold hand. She said softly, "I haven't seen you for a long time. You little girl, why don't you come to see me?" The eunuch was slightly surprised and changed the topic. But the eunuch did not dare to neglect and reported with a bitter face, "That guy insists that there is a difference between a man and a woman, and that it is disrespectful to see the princess in private. So he insisted on waiting outside. Now Mr. Peng is talking to him in the duty room." Sang let her hand hold and explained softly with her little face, "Young master has not been feeling well recently." Li Yu slightly lowered her eyes to hide the faint disappointment and anger in the bottom of her eyes. She no longer cared about the mud-like lad and took Sang-Sang's little hand to the flat couch. She laughed and said, "I don't know where your mischievous young master got his strength from recently. He runs to the second floor of the old library every day. How can he be feeling well? Your Highness, I think the young master is quite amazing." Sang spoke for Ning-Ke very seriously. Li Yu shook her head and chuckled. She stretched out her hand and knocked on Sang-Sang's slightly black forehead. She said, "Little girl, you only think about that young master all day long. You don't even think about how he looks like a decent young master. Speaking of this, I feel indignant. Ning-Ke really doesn't know how many generations of luck he has accumulated to be able to pick up a capable and diligent girl like you." As they spoke, the two women, one big and one small, bent their knees and sat on the soft couch with their legs crossed. The fate between people was really wonderful. When Li Yu first saw Sang Sang in the city of Wei, she felt close to her and pitied her for being ordered around by Ning Quebec. On the journey back from the grassland, Li Yu often talked to her as a maidservant. She really had some affection for her. Since Sang Sang grew up with Ning Ke, she did not have too many concepts of seniority in her mind. She simply felt that Her Highness was a good person and was willing to be close to her. Li Yu asked Sang Sang about their experiences after they arrived in Chang'an. Sang Sang honestly told her about the trivial matters such as opening a bookstore and taking examinations. Li Yu was thinking about the relationship between Ning Ke and Qiao Xiaoshu. Suddenly, she felt that Sang Sang's little hand was cold and rough. Looking at her slightly black face, she could not help but feel pity for her. She said, "I will let you get rid of your slave status and stop following Ning Quebec. You can come to my mansion and be a steward. How about that? I don't want you to serve others. You just need to manage the affairs of the mansion for me." In the front yard of the princess mansion, outside the guardhouse near the rockery pool, Peng Yutao frowned and looked at the pale lad on the chair beside him. He could not help but say, "You were so brave at the Northern Mountain Road. Why are you so pale and weak now? What's going on? Did you become a good-for-nothing after studying in the academy for a few days?" Ning Ke smiled and leaned lazily on the bamboo chair to bask in the sun. He looked at him and said, "Your Excellency Peng, you saw the bustle in the old library that day. Now that I think about it, it's still a little mysterious. It's no use mentioning it. By the way, where are those grassland barbarians? And since you and the guardsmen have made contributions, why are you still in the princess mansion?" The barbarians brought back by the princess from the grassland have been specially recruited by His Majesty into the Yulin Royal Guards. You know that the Tang Empire has always had such a rule. The Yulin Royal Guards are mostly foreigners. As for us, Peng Yutao smiled and said, "We followed Her Highness to fight and rush back from the grassland. We are really unwilling and worried to leave her side. The palace has the same idea. So although I am now the deputy commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion, I mainly follow Her Highness." The deputy commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion was a truly important position. Ning Ke congratulated him repeatedly, and then suddenly thought of the fight at Spring Breeze Pavilion that night. He could not help but be slightly startled, thinking that this position was probably vacated that night. Although the palace had tacitly allowed Peng Yutao to still follow Princess Li Yu, he was after all the deputy commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. Especially recently, the Valiant Cavalry Battalion of the Yulin Royal Guards had been shaken and purged, so he was extremely busy. After chatting with Ning Ke for a while, someone from the battalion said that there was something important to deal with. He apologized to Ning Ke twice and hurried away. Some of the guardsmen and barbarians who followed Princess Li Yu had now joined the Yulin Royal Guards, and some had returned to the palace. At this time, the guardsmen in the princess mansion basically did not know Ning Quebec. But seeing that Deputy Commander Peng Yutao was so polite to this lad, and knowing that Her Highness had specially summoned him, no one dared to be disrespectful to him. Ning Ke knew why the dignified Deputy Commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion was so polite to him. He had saved everyone's lives at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, and the Tangs respected heroes very much. Both sides had forged a friendship through fighting on the journey. More importantly, perhaps Peng Yutao had already sensed that the princess had the intention to recruit someone again. This was also the reason why Ning Ke did not enter the back garden of the princess mansion today. Now the focus and goal of his life were on revenge and the academy. He dared not get close to the struggle of the upper class of the empire. And based on a cold guess in the bottom of his heart, he subconsciously wanted to stay away from Her Highness. Although he had been dragged into the struggle of right and wrong after the battle with Qiao Xiaoshu that rainy night, whether he was willing or not, he was very clearly aware that he was still just a nobody. It was okay to follow Qiao Xiaoshu to fight in Jianghu at night for the palace, but to jump out of the gutter and directly confront those big powers, and nobody like him could die inexplicably and quietly at any time. Just like the general's mansion that had been destroyed, or like Joyer who had closed his eyes under the wall not long ago. Chapter 91. Thinking of these things that he could not fully understand with his IQ and experience, Ning Ke slowly closed his eyes in the sun and began to reconstruct Joyer's extremely dark face in his chaotic mind. He strengthened his confidence and sorted out his messy and confused thoughts. The spring sunshine shone on the rockery in the vestibule of the princess mansion, on the bamboo chair, and on his body. The brightness was just right, and the warmth was just right. Gradually, the coldness of spring that he had accumulated in the old library was all out. Are you basking in the sun? But Mom doesn't let me. A crisp voice sounded behind the chair. Ning Ke opened his eyes and looked back. He saw a little boy's face peeking out from the rockery. His dark and healthy face was blushing like an apple. His long eyelashes were very beautiful, but his expression was a little timid. Ning Ke looked at the little black face and somehow thought of Joyer. He felt a little sad. He stood up from the chair and bowed slightly to the little boy he had not seen for a long time. He said softly, "Greetings, little prince." The timid little boy was Xiaoman, the stepson that Princess Liu brought back from the grassland. Ning Ke had a lot of contact with the little boy on the way from the city of Wei to Chang'an, especially after the bloody battle on the northern mountain road. "Why doesn't Her Highness let you bask in the sun?" he asked with a smile. "Mom said it's easy to tan." Xiaoman looked at Ning Ke seriously and explained, "I'm Mom's son, the grandson recognized by His Majesty, and the proudest noble of the Tang Empire. So I can tan, but not too much." Ning Ke could not help scratching his head when he heard the little boy's answer. He could imagine the discomfort of a child from the grassland after coming to the rich and prosperous Chang'an city. He just did not expect that the princess would love and educate the little prince so strictly. He explained with a smile, "It's good to bask in the sun occasionally." It was quiet in the vestibule. The little boy looked around and found that the teaching nannies and palace maids did not notice that he had sneaked out. His little face lit up and he jumped to the bamboo chair. He pulled Ning Ke's sleeve and looked at him with expectant eyes. He said, "Can you tell me a story?" Ning Ke was stunned. He didn't expect the little boy to recognize him, and he didn't expect him to still remember the fairy tales by the fire. Looking at the little boy's expectant eyes and the quiet vestibule, she thought about how she had nothing else to do but bask in the sun, so she smiled and sat back on the bamboo chair. She gestured for the little boy to sit beside her and said, "I don't know how to tell stories. The ones I told you last time should be called fairy tales." "What's the difference between fairy tales and stories?" Buchi asked curiously. Ning Ke replied, "The story is very complicated, but the fairy tale is very simple and very happy." Xiaoman laughed happily and said, "Then I want to listen to fairy tales." Ning Ke recalled some scenes from the past and could not help but smile. He said, "This happens to be what I'm best at." Xiaoman moved her body closer to him and prepared to listen attentively. Ning Ke thought for a moment, looked at him and said, "You are a little prince on the grassland. Then I will tell you a fairy tale about a little prince, okay?" Xiaoman said excitedly, "Okay, okay." Ning Ke lay on the bamboo chair and looked at the sky. He said, "There are pythons in the forest. They are very big. After they catch their prey, they don't need to chew it. They just swallow it directly and then sleep for 6 months, using this time to digest the food in their stomachs." Xiaoman opened his eyes wide and said in horror, "That's terrible. Don't they say that fairy tales are all happy?" Ning Ke glared at him and thought that he was not as obedient as Sang Sang used to be. He said, "It's just the beginning. Don't worry. When I heard this story, I was more interested in the things in the forest, so I drew a picture according to my imagination. It was a big python swallowing a big beast. I showed the picture to other adults and asked them if they were scared. They said, What's so scary about a hat? Xiao Man clapped his hands excitedly and said, I see. You drew the snake as the edge of the hat and the big beast as the middle of the hat. Is your picture not good? Ning Ke was speechless and continued, I didn't draw a hat. It was a snake swallowing a beast. Those adults, like you, couldn't understand it at all. So I just drew the situation inside the python's stomach. Xiao Man looked at him in confusion and asked, Isn't it a fairy tale about the little prince? Where is the little prince? He will be out soon. Ning Ke explained, he will be out in a little while. It didn't take long for the teaching nannies and palace maids of the princess's mansion to find the vestibule. At this time, the princess also finished catching up with Sang Sang. Ning Ke took the little handmaiden's hand and ran away under the suspicious and resentful eyes of the nannies and palace maids. They finished their visit to the princess's mansion as quickly as possible. Walking on the quiet streets of Southern City, the big black umbrella tightly wrapped in coarse cloth kept patting Sang Sang's thigh. The master and handmaiden walked quietly for a while. Suddenly, Sang Sang said something out of the blue, the princess is a good person. Ning Ke looked up at the sky above the street that was separated by the sycamore trees. He looked at the clouds that were getting darker and darker and said, It looks like it's going to rain. Sang Sang wanted to say something, but Ning Ke didn't want to say those things. So the former said something out of the blue, while the latter looked up at the sky and said it was going to rain. Sang Sang stopped and looked up at him. She asked, Young master, why don't you like her? Ning Ke felt that it was necessary to let the little handmaiden know his true thoughts. He hesitated for a moment and said, Because I don't think she is a good person in the traditional sense, although she is really good to you. For some reason, Sang Sang showed a rare stubbornness on this issue. She said seriously, If Her Highness is not a good person, then why did she go to the grassland? Why is she so good to Xiao Man? Ning Ke looked at her quietly and suddenly said, If she is a good person, then why did she go to the grassland? Why is she so good to Xiao Man? I don't think that all stepmothers in the world are bad people, but I have never seen any stepmother like her who regards Xiao Man as more important than her own life. The same two questions could prove that Her Highness was a good person in Sang Sang's eyes, but it became the opposite in Ning Ke's eyes. She didn't understand what he was trying to say and looked at him in confusion. At this moment, rain gently floated down from the sky of Cheng and in the deep spring. Ning Ke untied the big black umbrella from her back and opened it. He continued to walk forward and said, There must be something wrong when things are abnormal. Her Highness's stepmother is still so young. Is she overflowing with maternal instinct? In my opinion, it's too early. I think it's empathy. She transferred her feelings for the Chanyu to the little boy. In this case, she seems to have a lot of apologies for the Chanyu who sleeps on the grassland. Only we, the border army, know how great the Chanyu was. But such a great figure was so inexplicably murdered by his idiot younger brother and usurped the throne? Young master, what are you trying to say? What I want to say is that Her Highness will probably regret it for the rest of her life. Because Chanyu should really love her, and he is the only man in the world who dares to really love her. I don't understand. Nothing. After a long silence, Sang Sang suddenly said, Do you think Her Highness killed Chanyu? Ning Ke didn't answer her directly, but said, It seems that your usual stupidity is indeed an act of laziness. Sang Sang lowered her head and walked under the black umbrella. She slightly clenched her small fists and said, Where's the evidence? There are many things in this world that don't need evidence. Ning Ke looked at the drizzle falling outside the umbrella and said, When she went to the grassland, she could not only defuse the attacks of some swindlers in the empire, but also gain His Majesty's pity by showing weakness in the battle with Her Majesty. She could also win the respect of the Tang people and even develop her own power on the grassland. But she couldn't stay on the grassland forever. His Majesty is getting older, and the successor has to be decided as soon as possible. So she needs to come back. As the woman Chanyu loved, there is only one way for her to come back. Sang Sang lowered her head and whispered, but Her Highness was only 12 or 13 when she decided to marry to the grassland. I started killing horse gang when I was 12 or 13. A person's ability is not necessarily proportional to his age. Ning Ke held the big black umbrella and gradually quickened his pace. He shook his head and said, "What I said just now was that Her Highness had a reason to do that and could benefit from it. But in my opinion, the most convincing thing is what I said before. We all know how great the young Chanyu was. Such a great man is hard to be framed and killed, unless the killer is the one he trusted and loved most." Sang Sang lowered her head and pursed her thin lips. She whispered, "Anyway, it's all your guess, young master." Ning Ke said, "I also hope that my guess is wrong. I also hope that the world is full of fairy tales, where the prince and the princess live happily ever after. But you see, the prince on the grassland is dead, and the princess comes home." Sang Sang raised her head, and a drop of rain slid down her dark cheek. She looked at him and asked angrily, "Young master, why is the world in your eyes always so dark?" Ning Ke stopped and looked at her silently. After a long time, he said coldly, "Because the world I saw was so dark from the moment I survived to the moment I found you in the pile of corpses by the roadside." After saying this, he also felt that he had lost his composure. He strode to the front of the street in embarrassment. He didn't know whether it was the shadow cast on his spirit by the old library of the academy, or because he was about to kill someone, but he always felt that the rain outside the big black umbrella was not so refreshing and seemed a little gloomy. Sang Sang stood in the rain and looked at his back. Suddenly she quickened her pace and caught up with him. She caught up to the big black umbrella and the guy, and then reached up to grab the corner of the sleeve of his right hand that was holding the umbrella and never let go again. The conversation between the master and the handmaiden could be heard from time to time under the big black umbrella. "I thought you were going to scold Her Highness as an idiot again. Don't be emotional about anything. You will only hurt others and yourself in the end. So she is indeed an idiot. Then why didn't you scold her just now? I will scold her less in the future, because those emotional idiots are all poor people." Chapter 92. The big black umbrella was like a black lotus, drifting away in the rain and fog of Chang'an. Sang Sang loosened her grip on the sleeve, looked up, and asked with a frown, "Young master, what were you talking about with Xiao Mang in the princess mansion?" "I saw that those nannies and palace maids looked terrible." Looking at the little girl who pretended to be calm, Ning Ke could not help but think of the scenes that often happened in Min Mountain. At that time, he carried her on his back and climbed from one perilous peak to another. At that time, he was busy exploring the way and telling fairy tales to the little girl in the basket. He was so busy that he could not help but smile and rub her head. He said, "Telling fairy tales. You know I'm good at it." Sang Sang asked curiously, "Which one? Cinderella or the Three Little Pigs?" "The Little Prince." Sang Sang frowned and asked seriously, "The Little Prince? Can he understand it?" Ning Ke was stunned and thought that it was indeed a problem. In the drizzle of late spring, the master and the handmaiden chatted all the way to the north. They passed through Tongshao Lane and returned to the eastern city. They did not walk into Lin 47th Street, but went around it and went deeper into the eastern city. The old brush pen shop was closed for the day. Sang Sang quietly came back with a padao tightly wrapped in cloth. There were slight raindrops on her shoulder. The rain gradually became heavier. The pedestrians on the streets of the eastern city were forced to return to their homes or workshops. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked to a remote poor square in the eastern city and stopped. They stood under the eaves of a dilapidated Haotian divine attendant temple with a big black umbrella. They looked into the square and listened to the faint sound of forging in the rain. Sang Sang said quietly, "The iron shop will be closed soon. The young masters will be busy sorting out today's orders. Chen Zixian will go back to the backyard to rest. I heard that he rarely hammered in these years. At that time, he would be the only one left in the yard. It's convenient for him to do that since it's raining today. Ning Ke looked at the dark clouds in the sky and silently calculated the time. He estimated that it was almost time. He handed the big black umbrella to Sang Sang and told her to wait for him. Then he took out a bamboo hat from behind and put it on his head. He walked toward the west of the square, passing through 2 alleys in the increasingly heavy rain and approaching the backyard of the blacksmith's shop in the square. The tough soles of his boots stepped on the bumpy stone path and made light splashes in the puddles. It was not noticeable in the rain at all. Ning Ke looked at the simple wooden door not far away and slowly walked forward. His left hand holding the pedal became tighter and tighter, and he silently recalled all the information of the second name. The names on the oil paper were the important figures in the massacre of the Xianwei general's mansion and the massacre of the village in the Yan territory. They were the results of Zhuo Er's investigation when he was a spy in the military ministry under Sheho's command. They were the information he exchanged with his sweat and life. Chen Zixian, 47 years old, the former deputy general under the command of the Xianwei general. He was rewarded by the imperial court for leading the Xianwei general Lin Guangyuan to commit treason. Later, in the 4th year of the Tianqi era, he was stripped of all his meritorious service and expelled from the army because of his reckless provocation. After that, his family suffered a series of disasters. His wife divorced him and returned to their hometown with their 2 young sons. However, he stayed in Chang'an and became a master in a blacksmith's shop in the eastern city of Chang'an. He was so poor that he could not bear to talk about it. After the massacre of the Xianwei general and the massacre of the village, except for 2 or 3 high-ranking officials who still enjoyed the high nobility and reputation, the rest of the people on the oil paper list were very poor. The censor who had died in his hands lived a depressed life, some lived in fear, and Chen Zixian, who was behind the courtyard door in the rain, lived a miserable life. Ning Ke could not figure out why. According to the usual inference or common plot lines in novels, when the people who had harmed the loyal and good and conspired to betray their master began to take revenge, they would be in a mess of arrogance and joy. Only then would they feel a natural sense of justice and pleasure. However, this was not the case. Those who he swore to take revenge and kill did not seem to be living better than him. He vaguely guessed that it should be the work of His Majesty, but he could not confirm it. He did not want to think about it anymore. Today, it was raining heavily and coincided with the summons from the princess's mansion. It was the best time to kill and take revenge. No matter how the government investigated in the future, they would not suspect or dare to suspect him. This was more important. He slightly lowered his head to look at the rainwater dripping from the edge of the bamboo hat. He slowly moved closer to the door. The surface of the peeling wooden door was slightly wet, and his fingers felt cold as he pressed on the door. He listened carefully to the sounds coming from the blacksmith workshop in the front of the courtyard. As he listened to the sound of the heavy hammers hitting the anvil, he slowly raised his left hand that held the cloth-wrapped pedal and pushed the wooden door open with his right. The old door axle that had been moistened by the rain made a soft whimpering sound. Wearing the bamboo hat, Ning Ke held the knife and entered. He calmly walked down the broken stone steps and looked at the old man squatting outside the woodshed in the courtyard. He said, "Chen Zixian?" Outside the woodshed, the old man was wearing an old, thin coat. The corners of his sleeves had burn marks from years of fire, and a few blackened cottons were sticking out of the cracks in the brittle cloth. He looked miserable. The old man's white hair was tied messily together. His thick iron hands held an axe and a piece of wood. He was chopping firewood. The old man raised his head, and a strange look flashed in his murky eyes. He looked at Ning Ke, who had pushed open the courtyard door. He looked at the shadow under the bamboo hat, trying to see his face clearly. After a moment of silence, he said, "I am." Ning Ke stopped and slightly raised his head to look around the shabby courtyard. He confirmed that all the apprentices were indeed in the front square and there was no one in the courtyard. He turned around and closed the courtyard door. He used his right hand to untie the tie of the bamboo hat around his neck. Then, He slowly held the front handle of the cloth-wrapped Biyao and continued to walk towards the old retired officer. The bamboo hat fell to the ground in the rain. Chen Zixian slowly blinked his eyes. His left hand that was full of black mud let go of the firewood and wiped it on the front of his clothes. Then, he reached behind his waist and grabbed a knife. At the same time, he raised his right hand that was holding the axe. He looked at the pale-faced lad who walked out of the wind and rain and said hoarsely, "Finally." Ning Kei's knife came. The sharp blade, which had been sharpened with rice water at the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street for more than 10 days, was pulled out of the scabbard with lightning speed. It easily cut through the old cloth that was tightly wrapped around the scabbard. It cut through the wind, the rain, and the past, heading straight for Chen Zixian's neck. Chen Zixian raised his knife. When the two knives met, there was a clear hum, and the rainwater on the knife's blade sputtered. At this moment, there was a rapid sound of iron striking in the iron workshop in front, covering all the sounds of knives in the courtyard. In the heavy rain, Ning Kei held the knife with both hands and moved forward expressionlessly. He cut the neck, beheaded the head, and cut the abdomen. The Biyao stirred the wind and rain, and the knife and axe in the old man's hands rubbed against each other coldly. Dang, 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 dang. Beside the red stove, the apprentices numbly held the red-hot iron and waved their heavy hammers to hit it again and again. They did not hear anything because of the loud sound of wind and rain outside the workshop. With a tearing sound, the thin robe was cut open, the axe was shaken off, and the wrist was cut off. Muffled groans sounded in the wind and rain, and the pile of firewood outside the room was scattered on the ground. In a flash, Ning Kei had chopped 17 times, and Chen Zixian had blocked the first 16. Then the sound of knives disappeared, leaving only the sound of wind, rain, and the thunder of hammering on the chopping board. Chen Zixian fell beside the pile of firewood. His body was covered in mud and water, and there were a few more drops of blood on his old and dark face. The thin jacket between his chest and abdomen had countless cuts, and the gray cotton was sticking out in all directions. The cut in the middle was extremely deep, so deep that it went all the way to his bones. Blood and other colored body fluids kept flowing out from his internal organs. The rain dripped from the eaves onto the pile of firewood, onto his gray hair, onto the sad wrinkles on his forehead, and then flowed down his dark cheeks, quickly washing away the few drops of blood. Ning Kei lowered his head and slowly sheathed his knife. Ning Kei lowered his head and slowly sheathed his blade. He looked at his rapidly rising and falling chest and the extremely dangerous axe mark on his chest. He could not help but frown. He did not expect that an ordinary deputy general of the Tang Empire could have such a strong combat power after suffering in the bottom of the market for so many years. Chen Zixian looked at the lad in front of him with turbid eyes, and there seemed to be a lot of phlegm in his throat. He painfully coughed a few times, and coughed out 2 mouthfuls of bloody phlegm. He said weakly, "I thought I had long been forgotten by the world." "You are indeed the most powerful person among those who have been forgotten. I think it is probably because you betrayed your master for glory, so no one in the imperial court dared to use you. I don't know if you have regretted it all these years." Ning Kei wiped the cold rain off his face, and looked at the dying old man and said, "But it is also because you have been forgotten by the world that I think killing you should not cause too much trouble. Besides, I have been admitted to the academy, and killing you is an indispensable part of my celebration, just like flowers and pigeons." Chen Zixian's old and weak eyes were full of confusion, and he said in a low voice, "Give me a quick death. It is still early, and it will take your poor apprentices a long time to finish today's orders." Ning Kei raised his head and looked at the sky. The rain was like a curtain of beads hanging from the clouds, and he could not see where the sun was. But he knew that he still had a lot of time, so he said softly, "As for the pleasure, you have made me very unhappy all these years, so don't expect to die too happily. I have a poem to read to you." He looked at the dying old man in the pile of firewood, and there was no expression on his face. He said calmly, "I came from the mountains and rivers, I came from the grassland, I came from the Yen territory, I came from the general's mansion to take your life. Hearing the words, General's Mansion, Chen Zixian's turbid eyes suddenly became bright, and his expression gradually became relieved. He subconsciously moved his trembling hands on the wet firewood, and stared at Ning Kei's young face, and said in a trembling voice, I see, it turns out, the general's son is still alive. You said, you have been admitted to the academy. It is so good, so good. I have lived such a tiring life these years, and I can die knowing, the general's son is still alive, and living well. I can really rest in peace. Who is not tired of living? Ning Kei looked down at the potholes in front of his feet, which were hit by the rain, and said in a low voice, I have to learn calligraphy, Olympiad math, piano, and painting, and I have to sit on the back seat of my mother's bicycle every weekend, and finally I am more familiar with the children's palace than my home. Don't you think I am tired? Chen Zixian did not understand what he said, and he covered the bleeding wound and shook his head in pain. Chapter 93. Ning Kei raised his head and looked at him expressionlessly. But there are still some benefits to that kind of tiredness. Those who have learned Olympiad math will not find it difficult when they look at the math questions in the academy. They will only feel stupid. It's much better than the tiredness I've experienced in my life. I came to this godforsaken place and lived a good life in the general's mansion for a few years. But because of you people, my good life is gone. Everyone I knew died, including my father and mother. I was only 4 years old at that time, but I had to consider the *T question of survival or death. Don't you think I'm tired? When he was 4 years old, he held a chopper tightly for the first time and killed someone for the first time. Then he saw the slightly black blood flowing along the chopper into his fingers and turning into a sticky semi-solid substance. It was then that he realized that chocolate hot pot was a very disgusting thing. After that, he washed his hands countless times, but he always felt that he could not wash away the smell of blood and the faint smell of rust on the chopper. This smell had been with him for a whole 12 years. He put his right hand into the rain and let the rain wash it continuously. But he always felt that there was no way to wash away the sticky blood between his fingers. He said with a pale face, I had never killed before, but now it's easier for me to kill people than it was for me to solve problems. I have never married, but I have to travel thousands of miles across Min Mountain with a little burden. Every time I see a person, I feel that he wants to kill me and take the burden away to be his concubine. Don't you think I'm tired? I'm so tired because of you. So I can only relax after I kill all of you. Only when all the blood in your body has flowed out, will I feel that the blood on my hands has been washed clean. So you can think of this as a cold-blooded revenge, but sometimes I think it's more like I'm washing my hands. Ning Kei looked at the dying old man and said, Use your blood to wash the blood on my hands. After saying this, he squatted down and picked up the chopping knife beside the old man. He looked at the old man and said, As for the question of whether you can rest in peace, you can ask when you see the heads of the people in the general's mansion in the underworld. But I believe that a boring guy like you, who lives a miserable life and thinks that you can't satisfy both sides, will not be able to rest in peace. He moved closer to the old man's ear and whispered a few words. Then, he tightly gripped the hatchet and skillfully chopped off the old man's neck. Standing up, he picked up the bamboo hat from the rainwater in the courtyard and put it back on his head. Then, he pushed open the courtyard gate and walked out. It was still raining in the courtyard, and the sound of iron being hammered could still be heard from the iron workshop in front. No one was chopping the firewood outside the woodshed, and the hatchet was stuck in the old man's neck. Chen Zixian, the former deputy general of the Xianwei general and now an old blacksmith in the eastern city of Chang'an, stared at the rain falling from the sky. His ice-cold eyes, which were like fish maws, were filled with gloominess and despair. He couldn't close his eyes, letting the rain hit his eyeballs and wash away the blood. Under the big black umbrella outside the slum square, Sang Sang silently looked at the entrance of the alley. Her posture hadn't changed since the beginning. Her small feet in old shoes had always been standing in the same place. The rain was getting heavier and wetting her hair and the clothes on her left shoulder. But she didn't take a few steps back to hide under the eaves. There was no one at the entrance of the alley, but she heard footsteps. She turned her head and saw Ning Kei, who was wearing a bamboo hat, walking out from an intersection on the west side. Under the shadow of the bamboo hat, his cheeks were extremely pale. She hurriedly held up the umbrella to shelter him from the rain, and then quickly left the alley when no one was paying attention. The second name on the oil paper list was finally crossed off today. Chen Zixian, who was killed, was one of the direct murderers of the extermination of the general's mansion. However, Ning Kei, who returned to the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street, didn't seem to be in a good mood. After wiping off the rain on his body and face, he directly lay on the bed and began to sleep without even washing his feet. He had been suffering in the old library these days, and both his body and spirit had been extremely weak. Today, he killed someone in the rain, and the string in his spirit was stretched to the extreme. Then, he suddenly relaxed, and with the cold spring rain, he directly lay on the bed like a mudslide in spring, unable to get up again. His slightly cold body couldn't feel much warmth, even though Sang Sang had already covered him with 2 quilts. He stared at the newly pasted roof and murmured, "Do you know why I have to enter the academy? Do you know why I've risked my life to stay in the old library? Do you know why I've risked my life to step into that world?" Sang Sang, who was squatting at the door, was busy cooking ginger soup. She didn't pay attention to his nonsense that would come every year and a half, nor did she have time to answer his boring questions. Ning Kei turned his head with difficulty and looked at the petite figure squatting by the doorstep. After a long silence, he smiled and said, "This question is a little ridiculous. Of course you know that, but others don't know that liking is actually the most fragile and powerless reason. It took so much effort to kill a censor and an old blacksmith. If I was still the me now, with 3 knives that look very strong, how could I have the ability to kill Xia Ho and the prince? Xia Ho is too powerful." He turned his head and stared at the newly pasted yellow paper on the roof again. He murmured, "How can I kill someone at the peak of martial arts? If I don't embark on the path of cultivation, I will never be able to kill him in this life. Her Highness said that if you insist on suffering in the old library every day, your body will be damaged." Sang Sang held the boiling hot ginger soup and sat on the edge of the bed. She struggled to help him up and said in a low voice, "I don't know if you can embark on the path of cultivation. You will die of illness before Xia Ho dies." Ning Kei took the bowl of ginger soup and licked his lips weakly. He took a sip and said in a low voice, "Hope may be illusory, but it's better than no hope at all. So I have to work hard." Sang Sang looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "Young master, have you ever thought that if Master Haotian really prevents you from embarking on the path of cultivation, what can you do?" Ning Kei passed the bowl to her and wiped the sweat on his forehead weakly. He smiled and said very slowly and calmly, "If Master Haotian is so bad." Nonsense, then I must go against heaven." Nonsense probably means to talk nonsense. Sang Sang thought that her young master had indeed started to talk nonsense intermittently again. She unhappily put him down and went to wash the dishes to prepare dinner, ignoring him. In the middle of the night, Ning Kei's nonsense became more and more frequent. Because he had a fever, his pale cheeks were covered with an unhealthy blush. His eyes occasionally opened and looked back and forth between the yellow paper on the roof and Sang Sang's face. He seemed to be unable to focus, and his dry and peeling lips spoke hoarsely and slightly incomprehensible words. Bicycle back seat, registration fee, youth and children's palace, chopper, chocolate, blood. Drag, blood, Min Mountain, blood, City of Wei, blood, grassland, blood, general's mansion was full of blood. On what basis? On what basis? On what basis? He grasped Sang Sang's cold little hand, but his eyes did not know where to fall. He tightly frowned and pursed his lips. His dimples were like a sad question mark, and his face was full of grievance. He kept saying these 3 words, looking very pitiful. Sang Sang changed the wet towel on his forehead and held him in her arms. She gently patted his back and softly coaxed, "Yes, it's all their fault. It has nothing to do with you, young master. It has nothing to do with you. They are all bad people." In the early morning, the rain in Chang'an stopped and Ning Kei's fever also subsided. He drowsily opened his eyes and felt a burning pain in his throat. He habitually wanted to ask Sang Sang to pour water for him, but he found someone beside him. He turned his head with difficulty and saw Sang Sang sitting on the bed with her clothes on. He did not know when she had fallen into a deep sleep. Glancing at her apologetically, he forced himself to get out of bed to get some water, but he still startled Sang Sang behind him. Sang Sang woke up with a start, hurriedly pushed him back onto the bed, and then jumped off. Ning Kei looked at her busy back and suddenly said, "Am I very useless?" Sang Sang brought the teacup to her lips and tested the temperature. She replied, "Young master, you are talking nonsense again." Ning Kei murmured, "I have read the article on the response of the Tao for so many years, but I still can't understand it. I can't even remember the words in that thin book on the ocean of Qi and mountain of snow. I have worked so hard but still can't cultivate. Now I have fallen to the point that I have to complain when I kill someone, and even get seriously ill. I am really useless." In the early morning, behind the tall and majestic red wall, in the imperial study surrounded by strange flowers and green trees, Li Zhongyi, the emperor of Tang, stood at the doorstep and stared blankly at the dripping rainwater on the leaves. The empress had just served him and washed up and had breakfast. For some reason, he suddenly wanted to take a look at the imperial study. As the emperor of Tang, the only man who made thousands of countries submit to him, he should not have any troubles in the eyes of ordinary people. However, at this time, he was silently looking at the garden, and his thin face was obviously a little restless. The headmaster of academy has gone to travel around the world again. I don't know when he will come back. Qiao Shaoshu has also finally slipped away. I don't know if he will come back. Li Zhongyi thought of the good teachers and friends who had recently left Chang'an, and his mood became heavier. Looking at the wet trees and flowers after the rain, he gradually felt lonely and lost. This was also the reason why he came to the imperial study early in the morning. Only in this room where no one would disturb him, he felt that he could obtain true peace. His Majesty loved calligraphy. Although he often summoned the officials to appreciate his books and paintings, other than the Empress and the fourth princess, who were extremely fond of him, no one dared to disturb his peace without an invitation. He even did not let the eunuchs and palace maids tidy up the room. He did all the books and paintings himself. He sighed and turned his head. He was ready to write a few pieces of lousy calligraphy to express his feelings. Suddenly, his expression slightly froze. He noticed that the direction of the books on a certain level of the bookshelf seemed to be a little different from before. Chapter 94. The emperor walked slowly to the bookshelf and lowered his body slightly. His slender fingers slowly slid across the neatly arranged books, and then stopped at the deepest part of the bookshelf. This row of the bookshelf contained the tablet stickers and the rare books of the old dynasty that the empire had gathered from the Sun Tian pavilion. He remembered clearly that the last time he tidied up the bookshelf, the books were slightly slanted from left to right. But now, the slanted direction was reversed. Could it be that someone had touched my bookshelf? He frowned slightly. His fingertips gently tapped on the edges of the books, and then his knuckles suddenly tightened, lifting the entire layer of books to another direction. Then, he saw a piece of paper hidden in the depths of the bookshelf. The emperor took out the piece of paper and placed it on the desk. He looked at the 5 words on the paper, which were dripping with ink. His brows furrowed even more. After looking at it in silence for a long time, he suddenly shouted, "Who touched my imperial study?" A moment later, 3 eunuchs knelt in the imperial study. The 3 eunuchs involuntarily raised their heads and looked at the slightly plump guard commander beside the desk. Their eyes were full of pleading for help. Su Chongshan was in charge of all the guards around the imperial study. The three eunuchs did not know why the emperor was angry, so they could only hope that he could stand up and say something. Su Chongshan carefully took 2 steps closer to the emperor and said softly, "Your Majesty, I can guarantee that no one dares to enter the imperial study without permission." The emperor, Li Zhongyi, had always been lenient in governing the country. These officials knew his temper and temperament very well. They did not feel afraid of the emperor as they served by his side every day. However, this matter involved the imperial study, so Su Chongshan did not dare to be careless. The emperor slammed the desk heavily and looked coldly at the 5 big words on the paper. He asked in a cold voice, "If no one dares to enter my imperial study without permission, then where did these 5 words come from? Could it be that it was written by a ghost from the underworld?" He frowned slightly and looked at the 5 words that seemed to be stabbing into his heart. He felt more and more irritated. After a short pause, he said, "It's something that happened this month. Look into it for me." Su Chongshan bowed respectfully. He caught a glimpse of the 4 ink words on the paper and was about to leave when he suddenly thought of the cheeky and bold lad at the beginning of the month. There was a buzzing sound in his head and his body suddenly became extremely stiff. The people in the palace were very disciplined and no one dared to enter the imperial study without permission. After thinking about it, it seemed that the only person who had the chance to get close to the imperial study and even enter the imperial study this month was that lad. "What's wrong? Did you remember something?" The emperor looked at his profile coldly. Su Chongshan smiled faintly and said, "I was just thinking that it might have been written by one of the study companions in the palace, and then it was mistakenly kept in the imperial study. Speaking of which, this handwriting is really good." The emperor glared at him angrily and reprimanded, "Am I inviting you to admire my calligraphy? Do you think I don't know if my handwriting is good or not? What I want you to investigate is who had the guts to enter my imperial study and use my brush to write." Su Chongshan smiled awkwardly and left the imperial study. After he closed the door of the imperial study, he slowly straightened his body and walked out of the garden in the pleasant spring breeze after the rain. Only then did he realize that his back had become wet and cold. A moment later, the deputy commander of the imperial guards appeared under the eaves of a cold and gloomy side hall. He stared coldly at the pale-faced eunuch, gritted his teeth, and said in a cold voice, "You are also one of my secret guards. At that time, I wanted you to bring him to the duty room behind the imperial study. How dare you leave him outside the imperial study and leave?" The little eunuch raised his head and said with a trembling voice, "Your Excellency, you ordered me to clear the area around the imperial study. In that case, it would be too conspicuous for me to stay there. Moreover, I did not know that Ning was so bold. He clearly knew that it was the imperial study and yet he still dared to enter. What's the use of saying this now? That idiot has already entered." Su Chongshan stared at him angrily and said, "His Majesty wants to investigate this matter now. Judging from His Majesty's expression, if he catches that guy, he will at least be flogged a dozen times. So you have to remember this. That idiot has never entered the palace, let alone the imperial study. Do you hear me?" The little eunuch said with a sad face, "Your Excellency, can't we just offer him up? His Majesty can flog him a dozen times as a punishment. We don't have to bear this responsibility for him." Su Chongshan said with hatred, "Idiot. That idiot is now my subordinate. If His Majesty finds out that the secret guards recruited such an idiot, wouldn't I be laughed to death? If His Majesty is still not satisfied and wants to punish me, who can I go to ask for justice? That's because of Master Chow. His Majesty has to show some consideration." The eunuch reminded timidly. Su Chongshan flicked his sleeves and left. He shouted, "Damn it, do I have to take the blame for that idiot because of Chow Xiaoshu?" Just when Su Chongshan and the little eunuch were about to cover up this matter, the Tang Emperor, Li Zhongyi, was staring at the calligraphy in the imperial study. Suddenly, he walked to the bookshelf and took out a box with a key. He took out a piece of calligraphy from the manuscripts that he rarely showed to others and placed it beside that piece of calligraphy. The first piece of calligraphy was written by the emperor on the night of the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident. He was going to give it to Cao Xiaoshu as a reward to comfort him for being trapped in the Black City all these years and to encourage him to serve the imperial court in the future. However, he did not expect that he would not have the chance to give it to Cao Xiaoshu after a conversation with him. Fish leaping into the sea. Is this not right? His Majesty frowned as he looked at the two pieces of calligraphy that were lined up side by side. His eyes moved to the other piece of calligraphy and murmured, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore? Can't it bloom on this shore? Can it only bloom when it leaves Chang'an and my Tang Empire?" The emperor's anger came from the fact that someone dared to touch the imperial study. It came from the four words that had pierced through the emotions that he had been deliberately trying not to think about. However, as his emotions gradually calmed down, he frowned as he looked at the 5 words, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore." Thinking of the dispute between him and Cao Xiaoshu that day, he gradually realized some other meaning. The fish leaping into the sea is my sea after all. The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore is the true heaven of freedom. Since I have trapped that guy for more than 10 years, letting him go is just to pay off the debt. Isn't giving freedom to others the same as giving freedom to myself? The emperor's eyebrows gradually relaxed. He thought of the disappointment he felt when he looked at the wet flowering trees in the morning. He thought of his friend, who was far from him in status but very similar in temperament. He thought that he might be walking on a mountain path with wet trees and flowers at this moment. He felt that he had also left Chang'an City, and that his body and mind were free. However, he was, after all, the emperor of the Tang Empire. Even though he had thought it through, he was still a little angry. He looked at the calligraphy and angrily rebuked, "Even if what you said is right, I can't let you off easily. I have to find out who wrote this. How dare they mock me? Who wrote this? How could it be written? It's so well written." Having seen through the conflict in his heart, his state of mind was naturally different from before. At this moment, His Majesty really looked at the calligraphy seriously. When he glanced at it previously, he only felt that the framework of the 5 words was right and peaceful. Now that he looked at it carefully, he found that the 5 words, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore," were slender and well-proportioned. The bone strength was strong and hidden in the full ink. It did not stand out at all. It was clear and strong, yet gentle and beautiful. It was indeed a wonderful work. This is really good. The strokes are both square and round, the structure is broad, the posture is charming and proud, agile and elegant, and the strength of character is contained. Who wrote this? It is so much better than me. His Majesty squinted his eyes and raised his eyebrows. His fingers slightly trembled as he brushed across the words, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore." He could not contain his joy. He knew that his evaluation of the 5 words was not fair. The words on the paper were not only much better than what he had written, they were not inferior to the calligraphy of the famous masters hanging on the wall. In fact, they were even better than them. Just as Ning Ke had sighed with emotion in the imperial study that day, the emperor of the Tang Empire's calligraphy was not very good, but his appreciation level was very high. The more he looked, the more fascinated he became. He even saw the feeling that Ning Ke felt when he was writing these 5 words that day. He felt that these 5 words were like hazy branches of flowers that bloomed on the other side of the sea, gently brushing his back from top to bottom, brushing away the depression and unhappiness that had accumulated over the past few days. Good writing. Really, really good writing. His Majesty only felt that his mind was broadened and his mood had returned to peace. He smiled at the 5 words on the paper and did not hesitate to give his most sincere praise. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and slammed the desk heavily. He shouted, "Guards!" After a while, the 3 eunuchs knelt on the floor of the imperial study again. They looked at the deputy commander of the bodyguards, Su Chongshan, for help. Su Chongshan suppressed the uneasiness in his heart and approached His Majesty. He asked, "Your Majesty, I am arranging the bodyguards to investigate in secret, but there is no news for a while." As one of the closest officials who knew His Majesty the best, he knew that His Majesty was not a person who held grudges. Not to mention a small matter like entering the imperial study to write a piece of calligraphy, His Majesty would not pursue the more ridiculous things that happened in the palace as long as it did not affect the political system of the country. He had originally planned to drag this matter on for a few days and then a few months until there was no trace of it. He did not expect that His Majesty would go against his usual wishes and put pressure on him repeatedly. The Emperor didn't even glance at him. He looked at the calligraphy scroll on the desk with incomparable fascination. Gently stroking the long beard on his chin, he ordered, "Find out who wrote this. Remember not to startle this calligrapher. Treat him with respect. After you find him, respectfully invite him into the palace. I want to ask him for some advice." Su Chongshan raised his head in shock. A moment later, the deputy commander of the royal guards, whose official robes were wet and dry, reappeared under the cold eaves of a certain side hall. He looked awkwardly at the young eunuch, who had a very interesting expression on his face, and said in confusion and embarrassment, "Yes, the situation in the royal study is like this. Now, it seems that the idiot is going to benefit from a disaster." The young eunuch patted his chest in fear and said with a sweet smile, "Your Majesty, this is a good opportunity. If there is a calligrapher who is appreciated by His Majesty among the secret guards, Your Majesty will be very proud. There is no opportunity, and no glory, at least for now." Su Chongshan looked at his loyal subordinate with a fake smile and said, "You have to remember that the idiot, no, Ning Ke did not enter the palace." The young eunuch looked at him in surprise and asked, "Your Majesty, why?" Su Chongshan laughed as if he was crying. His voice was squeezed out from between his teeth and said, "Because we did not admit it before. If we admit it now, it will be deceiving the Emperor." The young eunuch instantly understood the problem. He looked like he was crying, rubbing his small fists, and said in distress, "Look at this. How did a good thing turn into a bad thing?" Su Chongshan thought to himself, "Why are you crying here? I have turned a great opportunity to flatter His Majesty into a suspected crime of deceiving the Emperor. This is what I should cry bitterly for." Thinking of this, he could not help but feel extremely regretful. If he had taken the blame for Ning Ke in the beginning, he would not be in such a dilemma now. He was in such a king situation where he did not dare to take the hoe when he saw a mountain of treasures. The young eunuch rolled his eyes and looked at him carefully. He suggested another idea. "Why don't you report to His Majesty and say that you did not remember Ning Ke before, but remembered him after some investigation?" Idiot. Su Chongshan was already in an extremely bad mood. He reprimanded him. "You did not remember him at the beginning when it was time to punish him, and now you remember him when it is time to reward him. His Majesty is generous to us, but it does not mean that he is that. It is okay to hide some unimportant things from His Majesty, but if His Majesty thinks that his subjects really treat him as that, then you will know that in front of His Majesty, we are that." He forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart and said in a low voice, "We cannot admit to deceiving the Emperor. Since we did not admit it at the beginning, we will not admit it until we die." The young eunuch raised his head and looked at him innocently. He said, "If Ning Ke is found, we have no choice but to admit it." Su Chongshan said after a moment of silence, only time is the only standard to test the truth. This is the only thing that the idiot said that was not an idiot, and only time is the only way to reduce the punishment." The warm spring breeze blew across the lawn, through the flowering trees, into the quiet alley, and then through the gaps between the windows and the walls of the study room into the room. It felt warm and lazy as it caressed the faces of the young students. It was a good time to be sleepy in spring. However, the students of classroom 3 were not only sleepy, but also confused, because one of the study tables was empty. When the bell rang for the third time, the students left the study room in twos and threes. Some went back to Chung and City, some went to the kitchen to grab the freshest corn cob, and some dragged their scholarly feet along the stone path beside the wetland to the old library. When they arrived at the old library, they still did not see that guy. After asking the instructor, they found out that the guy did not sneak up to the second floor. The confusion in everyone's eyes grew stronger. Situilan and Jean Wuxia could not help but discuss with their classmates. Zhong Dajuan, on the other hand, frowned as he stood beside the bookshelf, deep in thought. They were used to seeing that guy go upstairs with a pale face every day. Now that they did not see that scene, everyone felt a little surprised. By the east window on the second floor of the old library, a female professor wearing a light-colored teaching robe slowly put down the pen in her hand. She calmly raised her head and looked in the direction of the staircase. After waiting for a while, she realized that no one came up, and she could not help but frown slightly. She did not agree with that student who did not cherish his body and forced himself to go upstairs to study. However, after watching him for so many days, she finally admired that student a little more. When she realized that the student did not come today, she guessed that he had probably given up. She could not help but feel a little regret in her heart. It was a pity that he did not persist. Chapter 95. At this moment, her eyes slightly brightened and her slightly frowning brows relaxed. She calmly looked in the direction of the staircase, but she did not expect that it was not that student who appeared at the staircase, but another young student with frivolous eyebrows and eyes. Chu Yuxian nervously walked upstairs. He had fainted once upstairs and heard of the countless painful experiences of his classmates. He also knew that even a person like Xie Qingyun vomited blood at night. All kinds of rumors made the book upstairs as terrible as the devil in the underworld in his heart, and he was extremely flustered. Walking to the east window, he shyly bowed deeply and respectfully said something to the female professor. The female professor slightly frowned and looked at him calmly. She calmly smiled and said, "It turns out that he is sick, and he even thought of telling me. This child is really gentle and polite. Please tell him to rest in peace for me." Xie Qingyun, the third young master of the Xie family in South Jin Kingdom, had given up going upstairs to study hard. Now that someone had asked for sick leave, the second floor of the old library became quieter and quieter. No one came up for several days. The female professor had already adapted to the quietness and lowered her head to write her small regular script. The spring breeze blew from the east window to the west window, and the flowering trees outside the building swayed. But someone did not know that the guy had asked for sick leave. Late at night, the stars hung in the night forest and scattered into the old library, sprinkling a silver frost on the wooden floor. The complicated carvings on the bookshelf at the end of the row suddenly brightened and dimmed, and then quietly slid away. Chen Pippi squeezed out with great difficulty and kept wiping the sweat on his forehead with a wet towel in his hand. He slowly walked to the bookshelf. His fat fingers accurately pointed at the thin book and then took it out. Chen Pippi casually flipped through it and found that the piece of paper he had put in the book was still there. No one had touched it or left any words. He could not help but roll his eyes and murmured angrily in a low voice, "How many days has it been? Why haven't you read it?" I, a genius, did not hesitate to violate the Academy's rules to teach you and solve your doubts. How dare you be so ungrateful? This matter was a little strange and interesting. Chen Pippi had always held himself to the standard of a genius, and he thought that all geniuses had to have a different way of doing things. For example, the eldest brother always had a nasty smile on his face and liked to drink water from lakes and streams. The second brother always wore a weird hat and would give the female students in the academy a few psychological lessons with extreme seriousness, and the headmaster had even more eccentricities. So he always wanted to do things that geniuses should do, things that could be written into the dark history of the academy in the future, such as breaking the rules of the academy to guide a poor person, or casually changing the course of someone's life with a few words, and so on. Since it was a sudden impulse, he didn't care too much about it. He wrote a few paragraphs about a preliminary exploration of ocean of Qi and mountain of snow on the thin paper. Whether the poor man could be enlightened or not was not his main concern. However, when he came to see the response excitedly the next night, he found that the guy didn't give a response. This matter became a little different, and he became very serious. When the spring rain stopped that morning, Ning Kei's fever was gone. But under Sung Sung's sometimes pitiful and sometimes fierce gaze, he lost to his little handmaiden countless times. He asked the carriage company to inform Chu Yuxian to ask for a 5-day sick leave from the academy on his behalf. He was allowed to eat fried egg noodles, hot and sour noodles, chicken stew, and potatoes every day. He was not allowed to touch the brush, ink, paper, and inkstone, to hurt his spirit, to sharpen his knife, to hurt his body, and to drink at the House of Red Sleeves. He was only allowed to sit in the armchair and hide on the wooden bed to rest and cultivate his spirit. After 5 days, Ning Kei's pale cheeks had already become rosy, and he was no longer as haggard as before. Even his cheeks were slightly puffed up, which made him look a little cute. If I eat hot and sour noodles again, I'll really throw up. He resolutely pushed away the big bowl in front of him, ignoring Sung Sung's offensive gaze. He took 2 steamed buns from her bowl, picked up 2 cabbage heads with his chopsticks, and ate the remaining half bowl of porridge. He stood up and walked out of the shop, saying, "If I eat chicken stew and potatoes again, don't blame me for running away from home." Sang Sang picked up the hot and sour noodles that he hadn't touched at all, and looked at the thin pieces of beef floating on the noodle soup. She thought to herself, why do you still dislike such good food? If you were in the city of Wei, could you eat noodles other than beef? The carriages in the carriage company that were rented by the academy students for a long time would be branded with the unique logo of the academy in a conspicuous position. Of course, there must be relevant documents for certification. Sitting in the carriage, Ning Kei easily passed through the south gate of Chang, and with this logo, and drove along the official road to the academy at the foot of the mountain in the south. At this time, the sky was just beginning to brighten. When they arrived at the academy and entered the study room, it was inevitable that there would be a lot of noise. Whether they were familiar with each other or not, seeing that their classmate had ended his sick leave and returned to class, the students would always come up to him with a few words of concern. Ning Kei was quite patient, and he casually chatted with everyone with a smile on his face, but his eyes were looking at everyone's expression. He found that in addition to Chu Yoxian's concern, Miss Situilan and Jean Wuxia's concern was also very real. Today's main class was calligraphy, and it was about the South Jin Kingdom's poetry and the appreciation of various styles. Ning Kei was fond of calligraphy and stone inscriptions, and in theory, he should be very interested in poetry. But for some reason, whether it was in his previous life or this life, he felt happy when he saw the ink characters, and bored when he saw the poems formed by the ink characters. Therefore, he naturally lost interest in this class. When the bell rang, he politely said a few words to the tutor, and rushed out of the study room to the kitchen. It was still a lunch for 2, and he still took 3 laps by the wetland. Those academy students who were quietly watching him could not help but click their tongues in wonder. They thought that Xia 3 vomited blood all night and gave up the idea of going upstairs, while Ning Kei returned to the academy after being seriously ill for a few days, as if nothing had happened. At the door of the old library, Chu Yuxian looked at his face with concern, and said, "You still want to go upstairs?" "Yes." Ning Kei answered, "It has been delayed for a few days, I have to hurry up." Chu Yuxian shook his head helplessly, and looked at him as if he was looking at a madman, and said, "Haven't you vomited enough?" "I'll get used to it after vomiting." Ning Kei answered with a smile. After saying this, he was slightly startled, and felt that this answer was so familiar, especially the last sentence that he said, as if he had heard or seen it somewhere before. Walking up to the second floor, he did not rush to the bookshelf to find the thin book, but instead tidied up his black scarf and robe, and walked to the east window, respectfully bowing to the female professor beside the desk, and said softly, "I'm back." The female professor slowly raised her head, looked at him, and said, "Can your body still hold up?" "Yes." Ning Ke touched his slightly plump cheeks, and said, "I'm sorry for troubling you. I'm not worried about anything." The female professor smiled, and said, "It's just that I have been copying books upstairs for 7 years. Although I'm used to the quietness, it feels good to have someone beside me quietly." Ning Ke smiled, and said, "I'll try my best to stay upstairs for a few more days." The female professor smiled and nodded, and waved her hand to indicate that he could do as he pleased. Ning Ke cupped his hands in front of his chest and turned to leave. He walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the thin booklet without even looking at it. He had already memorized the position of the booklet by heart. As long as he walked upstairs, he could find it accurately even if his eyes were blindfolded. It was a pity that he still did not remember the content that he should have memorized by heart. He sighed softly in his heart, and opened the book, A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. He saw the thin piece of paper in it, and took it out. He knew that he should have seen it before he went downstairs last time, but he knew that this little trick was meaningless, because this would always be the first page of the book for him. Suddenly, his brows furrowed slightly. He picked up the thin piece of paper with some doubt and looked out the window. He found that the back of the paper was densely packed with ink. He wondered where he had written so many words the last time he was here. He turned over the paper and looked at the back of the paper, and saw that the back of the paper was full of words written in small regular script. Although the person who left the words was very particular about rules and details, it was very strange that the strokes of the words, which were the size of rice grains, were open and smooth, with a strong sense of arrogance. Ning Ke looked at the words on the back of the paper in surprise, and then silently read the words left by the person in his heart. "Poor guy, don't believe that the mountain is not a mountain when you see it. Of course, the things that exist objectively are real. For example, the words on this book are more real than my arrogance and conceit. It's just that when the paper and the words reflect the spring sunshine outside the window and into your eyes, and then the spring sunshine reflected on the paper is already an explanation, and when you see it with your eyes, it is another explanation. The objective reality of things is like a naked beauty. When you look at her lustfully, think about how beautiful she is, and want to sleep with her. It doesn't matter if she is the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hongyu of the Westhill Divine Palace. The warm spring breeze blew inside and outside the building, and the afternoon sun began to turn golden and ruddy. Those male insects bathed in the red clouds began to sing loudly, flapping their wings and squeezing their air sacs, showing their strength and desire to the opposite sex with the wings and sound waves of the wind. Occasionally, when the wind was stronger, the singing in the forest and grass would suddenly stop. In the ears of these strong male insects, the sound of the wind was probably as terrible as the sound of thunder. Next to the bookshelf in the building, Ning Ke stared at the words on the paper in a daze. He was like a statue, unable to move for a long time. Those tiny characters were like thunder exploding in his head, buzzing incessantly. After a while, he opened the thin book, A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow, with his slightly trembling fingers. He glanced at the book and then moved his eyes away. His chest began to rise and fall with irrepressible excitement. With the help of the words on the paper, although he still couldn't know what was behind the door, he finally knew where the door was. Chapter 96. After gradually calming down, Ning Ke stared at the ink words on the paper in a daze, silently wondering who had left these words on the paper. Who was it that was answering his questions? Who was secretly helping him? Why did he do this? He quietly turned his head to the east window. The female professor was still calmly writing regular script and did not notice him at all. Ning Ke looked at the plain figure of the professor and thought of the extremely disrespectful explanation on the back of the paper. He subconsciously shook his head. It was impossible for such filthy words to be written by the female professor. Could it be the teacher in charge of the old library downstairs? Ning Ke frowned and thought about this question. Finally, he gently shook his head. Although the teacher in charge was humorous, he could see that he was a person who strictly abided by the rules. If he wanted to instruct Ning Ke, he would have said it face to face instead of choosing to leave a letter. After thinking about it, Ning Ke still could not figure out who left the letter on the paper. He confusedly looked out of the window and listened to the chirping of the male insects in the depths of the woods and grass. Then he laughed at himself and thought that the person who left the letter was probably an old and dirty teacher in charge of the academy. If Situilan and others saw these words, they would definitely jump up in anger. The words in the letter combined the way of reading books with the attitude towards women. Although it was obscene, it was extremely simple and easy to understand. Otherwise, Ning Ke could not have realized that he might have learned something from it in such a short time. In his view, the person who left the letter deliberately used this method to enlighten him. As the saying goes, seek the way from the filth. He could not help but admire this person to the extreme. He silently thought that the person who left the letter must be a cultivation genius. Since he was sure that the person who left the letter was a cultivation genius of the academy, Ning Ke naturally became more serious. He picked up the primary exploration of the ocean of Qi and mountain of snow and that thin paper, walked to the end of the bookshelf and sat down on the floor warmly illuminated by the sunset. After holding his breath and calming himself down for a moment, he began to read the letter again. Chen Pippi had obviously underestimated the poor Ning Ke's comprehension ability. Even if he did not write the last 2 paragraphs and did not explain it with an extreme attitude towards women, Ning Ke would still be able to understand the true meaning of what he wanted to express with the first few sentences about objective facts and understanding. Don't understand, don't think, just look at the text itself. Is this the original intention of the divine talisman master of the academy? What I need to do is to look at these words and not think about the meaning of these words. Ning Ke looked at the thin book on his knees and thought silently for a long time. These days, he had been reading the books in the building at the expense of his spirit. He was very clear about the impact those words had on his spiritual world. Comparing the two, he increasingly felt that the method of reading books suggested by the writer was worth a try. It was just that when you saw a word or phrase that you knew by heart, you had to not think about it. You had to pretend that you didn't know the meaning of the word or phrase. You didn't even have to pretend. You really wanted to forget the meaning of the word or phrase. No matter how you looked at it, it was extremely difficult. There was a big locust tree outside the courtyard that accompanied you through your childhood and adolescence. When you saw this big locust tree today, you had to pretend that you had never seen it before. You had to pretend that you didn't know it was a big locust tree. You had to forget that it was the big locust tree that accompanied you for countless years and witnessed your naughtiness and even your first love and first kiss. Who could do that? Ning Ke did not open the thin book on his knees. He stared at the thin paper beside the book in a daze. His mind had drifted out of the window to somewhere else. He was thinking hard about how to forget the meaning of the words he saw. To forget all the words I know. How can I do that? The sunlight outside the west window shone on his frowning eyebrows, giving off a faint luster. Suddenly, the tip of his eyebrows slightly raised and a flash of light flashed in Ning Ke's eyes. At this moment, he remembered the word he had written many years ago when he first came into contact with calligraphy. He remembered the word he had written countless times with a brush and a branch over the years. The word Yong. For anyone who had received ordinary calligraphy training, the word Yong would always be the most familiar word to them. In the Eastern Jin dynasty in that world, Mr. Wang Shiji, the most vigorous calligrapher in history, thought that the 8 strokes of calligraphy of Yong was just like the 8 skills of regular script. As the saying went, the point was the side, the horizontal was the restrain, the vertical was the crossbow, the hook was the leap, the lift was the tack, the skim was the sweep, the short skim was the peck, and the restrain was the chew. This was the famous 8 skills of calligraphy of Yong. Ning Kei's eyes became brighter and brighter. A word, yong, could basically form any word in the world if it was broken apart and reassembled. Then if he used the 8 skills of calligraphy of yong to look at it again, would he be able to recognize all the words as the word yong? He was very clear that this was not a wise or even a smart method. It was just a stupid method, and no one knew whether this method could be used or not. However, he could not suppress his inner desire and impulse at this time. After taking a deep breath, he did not hesitate to open the first page of the primary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. Heaven and earth breathe, which is called breath. Ning Kei stared at the word Tian at the beginning of the first sentence of the book. To be more precise, he did not see the whole word in his eyes, only the first stroke of the word Tian, a flat horizontal line. It was as if a sharp knife had drawn in the dark spiritual world. With a hissing sound, a faint white light seeped out from the tiny gap. Then, a second stroke of thick ink appeared in his eyes, followed by an indifferent long stroke, and finally a downward stroke. The full and complete word Tian on the page of the book appeared successively in his eyes and in his mind in this way of deconstruction. However, it could not form a complete meaning. There was a word in his eyes, but he was only allowed to see the strokes, and was not allowed to assemble it in his mind. It sounded simple, but it was extremely difficult to do. It was definitely not something that ordinary people could do. Fortunately, Ning Kei had painstakingly practiced calligraphy for nearly 20 years, and disassembling words had already become a kind of instinct. However, calligraphers required that every stroke should be finished first, and then the framework should be reconstructed. Now, he had forcibly cut off the most important part in his mind. If his spiritual instinct required him to assemble those strokes, the word yong in his mind would begin to play an important role, and he would interpret it as a part of the word yong instead of a part of the word tian. Even for him, it was extremely difficult to treat the unreal as the real thing. At this time, he had concentrated all his spirit, and his hands holding the book were slightly trembling. The back of his school robe was already wet with sweat. His eyelashes kept blinking painfully, and his lips were tightly pressed together, as if he had licked the tip of a pen for the first time in his childhood. This time, after the ink words in the book entered his eyes, they finally did not become blurred like countless times in the past, and then became blobs of ink, and then floated away from the paper and began to vibrate in his mind. Instead, they appeared extremely clearly and slowly in his field of vision, as quiet and tame as the leaves floating on the windless lake. At this moment, Ning Kei had completely forgotten how he had been tortured by these words. He just quietly looked at the strokes and the momentum of each stroke. It was as if he was looking at the surface of the lake under the breeze, and the leaves slowly drifting to the east and west, or drifting close to him. There was no wind and waves, no rainstorm in Spring Breeze Pavilion, and no pack of wolves on the grassland. He slightly drooped his eyelids and sat cross-legged on the floor at the end of the bookshelf in the warm afternoon sunshine. His trembling hands no longer trembled, his tense body gradually relaxed, and his tightly pressed lips gradually relaxed. He did not faint, or vomit, only calmness. The rise and fall of the wind were always gentle and graceful. The insects in the depths of the woods outside the building once again began to sing cheerfully, celebrating this happy spring day, celebrating the appearance of a new and interesting world in front of him. The gentle spring wind wrapped these songs and floated into the window, rippling in the empty and quiet space of the old library. Occasionally, it fell on the lad, gently brushing his clothes. The front of his school robe slightly trembled, as if some invisible force was slowly flowing inside. The traces on the front of the school robe did not flow smoothly and smoothly. Every time it reached a certain place on the chest and abdomen, it would quietly turn back, like the waves on the lake raised by the spring wind, pushing the leaves on the water to scatter around. Finally, it would touch the lakeside stone wall and silently turn back, unable to reach the shore or break the shore. At this time, the female professor by the east window seemed to sense something and slightly frowned. She raised her face and quietly listened to the insects outside the window and the movement of the spring wind. Then she turned her head to look at the lad under the west window and smiled slightly. It's called she. When Ning-Ke saw the word she, suddenly his mind was slightly distracted and his eyes subconsciously left the book. The whole word she came directly into his eyes with its complete structure. With a splash, a naughty shepherd boy threw a stone into the small lake. The water rippled slightly and the swaying leaves became chaotic. He only felt a buzz in his mind and suddenly became sober. Although he had experienced it many times, the word she still brought a great shock to his spiritual world. He groaned and stretched out his right hand at lightning speed to support his body on the wooden floor. He forced himself to turn his head and did not dare to look at any of the words in the book. His face was extremely pale. Even so, there was an irrepressible smile on his pale face at this time because he knew that he did see the door. Although it was not necessarily the door that the writer wanted to open for him, at least he did not faint after he opened the door. Moreover, he had a faint feeling that if he continued to read in this way, regardless of whether he could see the wonders of the cultivation world or not, it would be of great benefit to the art of calligraphy. He did not rush to stand up, but continued to sit cross-legged under the sun. He closed his eyes and began to recall the previous feeling, trying to find the strokes in the depths of his mind and the leaves that dissipated on the surface of the lake. After an unknown amount of time, he opened his eyes and smiled. Standing up, he walked to the table by the west window and picked up the brush and a new piece of paper. After a moment of contemplation, he began to write a reply to the person who had left the message. In the reply, he first sincerely thanked the writer for his guidance, and then wrote his solution and doubts very frankly. He asked the writer to comment on whether it was feasible or not. Finally, he very solemnly asked for advice. When reading the book and meditating, I seemed to see the movement of the leaves in the lake. Is that the original intention of the divine talisman master's strokes? I saw that the traces of the leaves in the lake were scattered, but indistinctly followed a pattern. I seemed to feel it in the ocean of chi in my chest and abdomen. Is that psyche power? Chapter 97. Ning-Ke held the two corners of the paper with his fingers and stretched it to the window. The warm sun and spring breeze outside quickly dried the ink. After confirming that there was no problem, he carefully folded the paper and put it back into the book in the same position as before. He stood up and put the book in its usual position on the bookshelf. Then he walked to the east window and bowed to the female professor respectfully. The female professor nodded slightly in return. Then he should go downstairs directly, but in the process of straightening up, he suddenly thought of something. He thought that this female professor must be a great figure in the academy since she had been practicing regular script in the old library for several years. Moreover, she seemed to be quiet and kind. Since the writer was willing to help him, maybe she would also be willing to help him? As a poor lad who had more than 2,000 taels of silver, Ning-Ke thought about it and felt that he could not let go of such an opportunity. After a short pause, he said respectfully, "Sir, when I was reading just now, I seemed to have learned something by forgetting the characters. I wonder if this method can still be used?" The female professor looked at him quietly. After a long time, she smiled and said, "According to the rules of the academy, even magic skills students can only read the books on this floor with their own power of understanding before they enter the second floor. However, you don't have the potential to cultivate, but you manage to understand some principles with your perseverance. Even though those principles aren't necessarily correct, it's still impressive. The rules of the academy cannot be broken. Then I have to give you a word." Ning-Ke bowed deeply and said respectfully, "Thank you for your guidance." The female professor looked at the hairpin-style small regular script on the desk in front of her and said calmly, "Reading characters, forgetting the shape, understanding the meaning. Reading with intention and without intention." Ning-Ke knew that he had not achieved the state of forgetting the shape and meaning of the words. He had used the method of disassembling the shape, which was still far from the state of forgetting the shape. As for the word, meaning, he did not know how to explain it. He could not help but shake his head and murmured the words, one can read it intentionally or unintentionally, as he walked down the stairs. It was already late at night. Usually, there would not be many people under the old library at this time. But today it was very lively. Situilan stood at the front, holding Jean Wuxia's hand. Chu Yuxian stood at the side of the stairs. Xia Qingyun and Zhong Dajuan could be faintly seen in the depths of the bookshelves. It seemed like they were welcoming him downstairs. Ning Ke looked at his classmates at the bottom of the stairs and was slightly stunned. He looked at Chu Yuxian and asked in a low voice, "What happened? You actually walked down by yourself?" Situilan looked at him in surprise and said. Ning Ke spread out his hands and said helplessly, "I think I also walked down last time, right?" Situilan smiled and said, "Let's get down to business. According to the rules of the academy over the years, the freshmen will have a gathering after entering the academy. There are always some classmates from other counties or even foreign countries who have never been to Chang'an. The so-called gathering is to show everyone around, drink some wine and gossip. Our classroom 3 will also have a gathering. Wuxia and I, who have lived in Chang'an for a long time, are naturally duty-bound, so we will take the lead. It should have been held a few days ago, but because you are on sick leave, it was postponed to today. We don't want to disturb you reading upstairs, so we are waiting here." Ning Ke looked at the girl in front of him and found that she had already taken off her student robe and changed into a lavender skirt. She did not look as sharp and tough as she usually did when she wore her archery uniform, but unexpectedly showed a bit of the gentleness of a noble family. Although he was eager to return to Lin 47th Street to tell Sang Sang about today's amazing encounter, he also knew that there was no way to avoid the gathering of the academy's classmates. Moreover, Classroom 3 had postponed the gathering to today in order to wait for him to recover. No matter what, he had to attend. There were all young people around him, so he said straightforwardly, "No problem." Situilan laughed heartily and said, "Your straightforward character is not bad, unlike Chen Zixian and the others who ran away with the excuse of family matters. Who doesn't know which gambling house they are in now?" Hearing the 3 words, Chen Zixian, Ning Ke was slightly startled. He immediately understood that she was talking about Chen Zixian, the son of a rich businessman from Classroom 3, and not the old man who fell beside the pile of firewood and could not close his eyes. Situilan looked back at the students around her and laughed heartily. "Is there any place that you want to visit, or Chang and food that you want to eat? If you don't have any ideas, then I'm the one." The students from other places all laughed and said that they had no objections. She rolled her eyes and suddenly said to Ning Ke, "How about we go for a drink?" "I still don't have any objections," Ning Ke said. Situilan looked at his face and teased, "Last time Chu Yuxian said that you don't need to pay to drink at the House of Red Sleeves. Why don't we go there? I believe that you don't have any objections either." Ning Ke was startled. When he was about to say that he had a strong objection, he saw that she had already turned around to announce the news to the crowd. It was said that today's gathering would be held at the House of Red Sleeves. Hearing this decision, the crowd inside and outside of the old library suddenly became angry. A student from Gushan Commandery shook his head and praised, "To be able to see the real face of the world's #1 singing and dancing troupe, this trip to Chang'an is really worthwhile." A student from the capital of Great River Kingdom solemnly said, "Yes, this time we must see the Tang Emperor's favorite dance." A former captain of the Tang Empire's border army from the remote Hanggu Valley said seriously, "That's right. Tonight, all of you must write some good poems to record our grand occasion." All the students shook their heads and praised. All of them seemed to be full of literary aura. But everyone knew that what these young students really wanted to see was not singing and dancing, but the famous prostitutes who were rumored to be the top of the world's brothels. What they really wanted to do was not poetry, but to make love in the brothel. Although Situilan and several other ladies from official families could not really be unrestrained, it was also an excellent thing to be close to those soul-stirring beauties. Ning Ke grabbed Chu Yuxian beside him and asked in surprise, women, can also enter the brothel? There is no place in Chang and that these women dare not go. Moreover, the House of Red Sleeves is a singing and dancing troupe promoted by the palace. If they say they want to see the song and dance, no one can say anything. Chu Yuxian helplessly said. At this moment, a hand stretched out from the depths of the bookshelf, and a skinny student slowly moved out. It was Linchuan Wangying, who was known as a genius. He looked at the crowd and said timidly, "Can I go with you?" All the students looked at this 14-year-old lad and looked at each other. Situilan gently bit her lips, rolled her eyes and said with a sullen face, "Wang Ying, you can't go. You have to know that you are Ding Shi's." The atmosphere of the Tang Empire had always been swaying between simplicity and toughness and open-mindedness. To be more precise, it should be stepping on both sides happily and swaying back and forth. Especially for the people living in Chang'an, they were naturally simple and tough when talking about national affairs and morale, and they were naturally open-mindedness when talking about literature and romance. They never felt that there was any conflict between the two styles. The serious and upright civil officials in the imperial court would go to the tavern next to the mansion to play a song for the blind girl after leaving the court. The women in the brothel would also go to the brothel to donate when talking about the frontier fortress war. Therefore, the brothel in Chang'an was different from the brothel in other places. It was not just a place with red lanterns hanging high and full of lustful fragrance. There were also times when there were vigorous dances and clangs. Except for those censors who lived by criticizing others, no matter if it was officials or rich businessmen, they would not feel that there was anything wrong with appearing in such a place. Speaking of brothels, the first name to be mentioned was naturally the House of Red Sleeves. For many years, there had never been a signboard outside the musical bamboo courtyard, but everyone knew that it was the first signboard of the brothel industry in Chang'an and even in the Tang Empire. It was favored by the former emperor and his majesty, and had a glorious past. Even though it was far away in a quiet neighborhood, its reputation spread far and wide. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves was as bright as usual. Tonight, the spring wind was romantic. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves sang and danced to celebrate peace. Tonight, no one slept in the House of Red Sleeves. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves became a little chaotic. When more than 20 young men and women of the academy barged into the building with their heads lowered shyly or proudly, the rich businessmen and officials who were drinking and enjoying the singing and dancing in the hall suddenly froze. After recognizing the identities of several female students dressed as men, they sighed and quickly dispersed in all directions. Chang'an was indeed open. It was not uncommon for women to dress up as men to visit brothels. It was not rare for a father and a son to go to a girl one after another. However, it was still a little embarrassing for two generations to appear in the same brothel at the same time. What was strange was that in such an embarrassing situation, it was always the elders who gave way to the younger generation, such as now. Situilan asked her classmates to sit down. Looking at the back of the person who slipped out of the side door of the brothel, who looked like her fourth uncle, she held back her laughter and waved her sleeves to sit down. She called the steward and asked, "I know there is no rule in the brothel to reserve the whole place. But there are many of us. Is it okay to fill up the front hall and watch the singing and dancing?" The steward had already recognized the identity of this famous noble lady in Chang'an. He did not dare to neglect her and said with a bitter face, "Miss Situ. Or should I still call you young master today? Whatever you say, of course. You know what's good for you." Situilan rolled her black eyes and threw a golden leaf to the steward. She said, "Bring the wine, fruits, and food quickly. Today there is a rich man paying the bill. Also, I want Lu Shui to accompany me. Last year when I came to your brothel, you said she went to the palace. It can't be so coincidental today, right?" The steward revealed an awkward expression and smiled apologetically. "It's true that she didn't enter the palace, but you know that His Majesty is holding a banquet for the princess's return." The girls of the song and dance troupe have been practicing hard. Miss Lu Shui is the lead dancer, so everyone specially gave her a month off. Now, whether she wants to come out or not is really up to her. Speaking of the top girls in the House of Red Sleeves, Dewdrop was naturally one of them. But Lu Shui's status was a little different. She was the lead dancer in the song and dance troupe and was once praised by the Empress. If she was not willing to come out and drink with the guests, no one could force her. After all, Situilan was just a young girl. She was always curious when she went to the brothel to drink and play. She was not willing to find girls who did not mind having regular guests. But Lu Shui was very different. So when she heard that Lu Shui was on vacation, she could not help but feel a little annoyed. Ning Ke lowered his head and followed his classmates into the House of Red Sleeves. He dragged Chu Yuxian to the most remote seat and quietly listened to the conversation between Situilan and the steward. At the same time, he was thinking about the important problem of who would pay the bill tonight. After a while, he looked at Chu Yuxian and said with sympathy, "She said there is a rich man paying the bill today. I think it will be you who will lose money again. After all, you are a landlord and a rich man in Chang'an City." Chu Yuxian opened his folding fan and said sarcastically, "Obviously, the rich man tonight is surnamed Ning." After saying this, he stood up and scolded the steward with a smile, "Hua Shao, are you blind? Look who's sitting beside me. Hurry up and call Lu Shui and Dewdrop out." Chapter 98. The steward called Hua Shao thought of a lad who often appeared in court at the House of Red Sleeves in the 13th year of the Tianqi era. His heart tightened and he looked toward the source of the voice. He saw clearly the face of the person beside the first young Master Chu and found that it was the wicked guy who called girls without paying. His body suddenly became stiff and his expression became extremely ugly. He thought bitterly in his heart, "Since we haven't seen each other for a long time, why should we meet again today?" For people in the service industry, their thoughts and behaviors could never be synchronized. Steward Hua kept cursing Ning Ke's parents and ancestors in his heart, but the ugly expression on his face quickly turned into a few bright flowers. He did not dare to hesitate and bowed to that person across several tables. Then, he turned around and put his right hand to his lips, shouting cheerfully toward the quiet and sparsely lit upstairs, "Ladies upstairs and downstairs. Young Master Ning Ke is here." No one knew how many people in the building were shocked by this shout. The students who were pretending to be shy and calm or pretending to be proud of themselves all looked at Ning Ke's table in surprise. Situilan held the teacup and opened her mouth in surprise. Jean Wuxia could no longer maintain her gentle expression and thought to herself, "What kind of reception is this? Why does it seem that everyone in the House of Red Sleeves knows Ning Ke?" The students were surprised and expectant. They looked up to the upstairs with curiosity and disbelief. They wanted to see how many girls would poke their heads out to see Steward Hua after his shout. The music on the balcony had stopped and it was quiet in the building. There were no beauties who could not wait to look at Ning Ke, no girls who smiled and waved to him, and even no maidservants who came to check on the situation for their mistress appeared. Just when the expectant students were a little disappointed, some felt a little balanced, and Situilan felt a little bored, suddenly there was a dense sound of footsteps in and behind the building. Just like big and small pearls falling on a jade plate, or like heavy rain and light rain playing in the spring breeze pavilion, in the sound of footsteps, beads swaying, and orioles singing and swallows talking, 6 or 7 girls from the backyard of the building came out in a line with their personal maidservants. They gathered in the hall like flowing water, and then came to Ning Ke's side. Some of them blamed him for not coming for a few days, some of them gently cared why he did not come these days, and some of them frowned and wondered if something had happened to him. In short, it was very lively. While they were busy, a little girl with a cute pair of hair poked out from the top floor. She was Mistress Jian's personal maidservant, Xiao Chao. Her dark eyes rolled around, but she didn't see the person she wanted to see. She shouted unhappily, Ning Ke, why isn't Sang Sang here? You shut her up in the shop again. That night, the bored girls in the House of Red Sleeves who were preparing to go to the palace to practice singing and dancing. They ridiculed and hurt the fragile and sensitive heart of a young man, and pushed Ning Ke into the building. After that night, things began to change subtly. Whether it was Dewdrop or Lu Shui, or those ordinary girls, they all treated Ning Ke very warmly and cordially. There were only 3 reasons. First, Ning Ke had a clean and pleasant face, and was a rare young man in the brothel. He spoke well, behaved in a cute manner, and respected the girls. Moreover, they didn't have that kind of relationship, so they got along with each other easily and became very familiar with each other. Second, Dewdrop doted on this guy because of some purely personal reasons, so the girls of the Zhu family naturally gave him more face. The most important reason was naturally that Mistress Jian had once expressed a certain degree of concern for this lad. This concern was not obvious, but it was too rare for Mistress Jian, who had always been indifferent to men and even hated them. Dewdrop and Lu Shui did not care about it, but for the other girls, if they could please Mistress Jian, not to mention being more intimate with Ning Ke, even if they had to sacrifice their bodies for a few nights, it would not be a big deal. However, the academy's classmates didn't know these reasons, nor did they know how many times Ning Ke went in and out of the House of Red Sleeves in the spring. They were already dumbfounded as they looked at the girls around the table and listened to their sweet voices. Situilan finally put down the teacup slowly and closed her mouth. But when she saw Lu Shui, whom she had failed to invite twice, sitting beside Ning Ke and chatting with him while eating melon seeds, she couldn't help but look at Jin Wuxia, who was dressed as a man, and said with a shocked expression, Chu Yuxian didn't lie. Ning Ke really can go anywhere in the House of Red Sleeves. This guy is much more respected than my arrogant cousins. While they were talking, Ning Ke and the girls had finished their greetings and bid farewell to each other warmly. Then he raised his right hand slightly to hold Lu Shui's hand and walked to Situilan's table. He said with a smile, Miss Situ, I've brought Lu Shui here for you. You have to pity her for her hard practice recently and let her go back to rest early. Situilan stood up and pretended to be angry but was actually happy. She said, we girls are talking, it's none of your business. After saying this, she turned around and bowed to Lu Shui. She said very seriously, Sister Lu Shui, I've always wanted to see you and ask you about the middle 3 kicks of the Hu Xian dance. It's a pleasure to meet you today. I hope you can teach me. Lu Shui slightly frowned. She was indeed a little tired, but she knew it was not a good choice to act like a famous prostitute in front of these noble ladies of Chang'an. Jin Wuxia also stood up and gently tapped the thumb and forefinger of her left hand with the folding fan in her right hand. She said with a smile, Miss Lu Shui, my sister Situ wants to learn the middle 3 kicks of the Hu Xian dance because it's the 60th birthday of Yunhui General at the end of this year. She wants to present this dance as a gift. It's not necessary for her to learn it today. I just hope you can spare some time for her. I see. Lu Shui smiled faintly and said, then I will dance a little tonight. In the future, if Miss Situ wants to invite me, you only need to inform me of the time in advance. It will be very convenient whether you come or I go to your residence. The Hu dance had nothing to do with the grassland barbarians, but came from the Yueluan kingdom. It was said that its origin was the sacrificial dance of a rainforest tribe in the extreme west of the Yueluan kingdom. It was famous for its lively rhythm, especially when the upper part of the dancer's body was still like a fairy scattering flowers, while the lower part was shaking rapidly. The waist, abdomen, and thighs were dancing with the song, which would form a very sharp contrast of beauty. This kind of dance was extremely difficult. The lower 3 kicks were relatively easy to achieve, but it was extremely difficult to complete the middle 3 kicks or even the upper 3 kicks while keeping the upper part of the upper body modestly still. The best Hu dance girl in the world was in Chang and of the Tang Empire, in the House of Red Sleeves. She was Lu Shui. In the sound of the pipa, there was a faint flute fluttering. The lights in the quiet building dimmed slightly. When the curtain was lifted, Lu Shui, who was wearing a gauze dance gown that exposed her abdomen and wrapped around her buttocks, walked in. Her eyes were gentle and her hands were clasped in front of her white breasts. Neither her fingertips nor her eyelashes trembled. However, her bare snow-like feet were slowly dancing to the music. Especially as the pipa became more and more urgent, the frequency of her feet stepping on the stage became faster and faster. Her thighs and buttocks tightly wrapped by the gauze dance gown kept shaking like lightning, and her exposed abdomen swayed with fine lines. After the dance, countless cheers rang out, and then the building returned to a warm and lively atmosphere. Situilan seriously toasted Lu Shui, and everyone casually said a few words. Lu Shui, who looked tired, gently apologized and went back to her own yard to rest. Hu Xian was the best accompaniment to wine. Tonight, there were more than 20 young students in the House of Red Sleeves, who were in the middle of their youth. Immediately, the wine went down quickly. The elegant sound of Meng Shu's drinking was mixed with the sound of chips being tossed. The hall was lively and cheerful. Tonight, Ning Ke had been pushed into the limelight by Chu Yuxian and the manager of the brothel. Naturally, he became the center of the drinking scene. Regardless of whether they were familiar with each other or not, the students all went up to him and tried to persuade him for various reasons. In the beginning, they would still play drinking games and play drinking games. But when they realized that Ning Ke was really a genius at playing drinking games, and after he won more than 10 rounds, the drinking games became drinking games. Ning Ke liked to drink, and he liked the taste of wine even more. These years, he had been drinking with Sang Sang. But it was a pity or sad that after drinking for so many years, his capacity for liquor did not increase at all. Basically, he was still in the state of looking at the wine and drinking games, but because he was too drunk, he basically had no chance to do so. After being urged by his classmates to drink 5 or 6 glasses of wine, he became anxious. His drunkenness, which was only 7%, suddenly jumped to 12%. He forced his eyes open, trying to pretend that he was still sober to scare off his enemies. However, his already inarticulate speech revealed his weak confidence. So he wanted to hug the full moon to pretend to be lonely and hide from drinking, but found that there was still no moon in the night sky. He wanted to lean against the railing and pour wine into the lake to get drunk and recite poems to pretend to be desperate, but found that he could not walk to the railing and could not remember any poems. No matter in the previous life or this life. He did not know when the table he was sitting at was moved to the railing at the back of the building, just close to the small pond of wet bamboo. But he was already paralyzed on the edge of the table, and had long forgotten what he had planned to do. The environment by the railing was much quieter than in the hall. Situilan sat beside him with her right foot on the railing, squinting at the stars in the sky. Her right hand was holding a small pot of clear jade house snow, gently shaking it outside the railing. Obviously, this noblewoman's capacity for liquor was much better than Ning Ke's. The luster in her eyes was very bright. She suddenly asked, "Ning Ke, how did you and Sister Princess meet?" Ning Ke raised his head and rubbed between his eyebrows. Then he raised his chopsticks and kept looking for the cabbage head in vinegar. He casually answered, "I met her on the road." "How did you meet her on the road?" Situilan turned her head and stared at him with interest. Ning Ke inserted his chopsticks into the small pastry, covered his forehead and said angrily, "I picked her up on the road, so we met." Situilan said helplessly, "I think you probably remembered something wrong. Her Highness couldn't have been picked up by you on the road." Ning Ke smiled with drunkenness, "Indeed, I remembered wrong. All the things I picked up on the road are treasures. I can't be an idiot. Where did I meet the princess?" "Oh yes, you know I'm a soldier of the city of Wei." Chapter 99. Is the city of Wei very far? Very close to Kaiping. Where is Kaiping? Very close to the city of Wei. Well, I know it's in the frontier fortress. But before that, where were you, Ning Ke? In the mountain. Which mountain? Min Mountain. Is Min Mountain very big? Of course. What about before Min Mountain? What about before? Well, I was young then, so I don't remember much. I only know that I was an orphan. The drunken conversation by the side of the bar could not continue because of Ning Ke's slurred speech and his stubborn mind. Situilan picked up a wet towel and wiped her forehead. She glared at the drunk lad on the table and thought to herself, what the hell is going on? Just at this moment, Dewdrop, who had to leave midway, came and diluted the awkwardness. She frowned at the back of Ning Ke's head and could not help but shake her head. She helped him up and put a wet towel on his forehead. Then she smiled at Situilan and said in a hoarse voice, Miss Situ, he can't hold his liquor well. Before Situilan could open her mouth to ridicule him, Ning Ke, who was lying in Dewdrop's arms, woke up. His mind was in a blur, and he vaguely felt that his face was pressed against a slightly cool, moist, and plump place. Subconsciously or instinctively, he held her waist tightly with both hands and pressed his face closer to her, even rubbing against it. Dewdrop's plump bosom was squeezed out of shape by the young man's bad taste. Her delicate and pretty little face showed a rare hint of charming shyness, and there were a few blushes on it. Situilan looked at Ning Ke squinting in Dewdrop's arms. She watched him put his hands into the girl's sleeves and then move to somewhere. She could not help but raise her head and cover her forehead in annoyance. She also covered her eyes. After all, she was a noble lady of the Yunhui general's mansion in Chang'an. Seeking pleasure in the brothel was just a matter of elegance. When had she ever seen someone actually dared to do indecent things in front of her? Of course, she knew that Ning Ke had drunk too much at this time. He was so drunk that he might not even be able to tell whether he was hugging a waist or a willow, rubbing a chest or a big steamed bun. But for an unmarried girl, even one who was famous for being bold and unrestrained in Chang'an City, this scene was really unbearable. She stood up in embarrassment and anger, pulled Ning Ke up, and continued to pour wine into his mouth. Ning Ke vaguely felt that someone was trying to force him to drink more wine. How could he allow that to happen? He hugged Dewdrop's waist tightly and refused to let go. His palm slid down her lapel and kept rubbing the girl's soft and plump abdomen. He kept muttering nonsense like, this is better than drinking wine, and, I won't drink anymore. Dewdrop giggled as he touched her. She hurriedly lifted her sleeve to cover her lips and said with an annoyed smile, you'll have to pay if you touch me again. Ning Ke lowered himself in her arms and answered in a daze, your brother is now a man with a net worth of 2,000 taels of silver. Do I still need this little bit of silver? If a monk can touch you, why can't I touch you? So what if we spend a spring together? Dewdrop was a little annoyed when she heard this, but she was confused when she heard the word monk. She raised her head and looked at Situilan for help. Situilan spread out her hands and said angrily, how would I know what nonsense you are talking about? Then she used a little strength to grab the front of Ning Ke's lapel and forcibly lifted him up. She got close to his face and said loudly, you've drunk too much. Go back quickly. Don't tell me there's no one waiting for you at home. No one knew whether it was because he had been blown by the night wind for a long time, or because Situilan shook him hard, or some key words in this sentence that touched the sensitive soul in Ning Ke's mind. He suddenly stiffened and slowly woke up. He opened his dull eyes and looked at the night view outside the fence and murmured, yes, there's someone waiting for me at home. Situilan and Dewdrop looked at each other and heaved a sigh of relief at the same time. They were not concerned about where Ning Ke got the 2,000 taels of silver from. What they were happy about was that the two of them finally did not have to accompany this young master who suddenly became rich from the poor to go crazy. However, to their surprise, Ning Ke stood up shakily, broke away from Situilan's hand and gently avoided her. Dewdrop, who wanted to help him, staggered into the building. She grabbed a writing brush from the accountant's office and tore a page of the account book. Yushan leaned against the table and wrote some numbers in cursive with drunken eyes. Then he said, "Send it back to Lin 47th Street for me." Dewdrop moved closer to take a look and saw a few words scribbled on the account book. The frame of the words was crooked and scattered, and the white strands were unclear. If one did not look carefully, they would not be able to tell what was written. Young Master Sang, I'm drunk today, so I won't come back to sleep. Remember to drink the chicken soup left in the pot. Ning Ke was a man who looked gentle on the outside but was extremely calm and self-controlled in his bones. He knew very well that he could not hold his liquor, so he rarely lost control of himself after drinking too much except when he was drinking with Sang. However, the situation was a little different this time. He was so happy today that he felt depressed without any alcohol to liven things up. This joy that came from the bottom of his heart had nothing to do with the endless nights in the brothel, nor did it have anything to do with his classmates from the academy taking advantage of their youth. It was purely because he saw the message on the thin piece of paper in the old library. In the warm afternoon sunshine, he vaguely saw the direction of the door to the wonderful world. After more than 10 years of desperate searching, he finally saw a glimmer of hope. What else in the world could be more suitable than this, and what else could be more suitable than this? What else could be more suitable than this? What else could be more suitable than this? Dewdrop saw his cute drunken look and could not help laughing. She held his left arm and shook her head, saying, "Don't drink anymore. I'll ask the carriage company to send you home later." Ning Ke gently held her hand. His palm was slightly wet with sweat. Only then did he realize that the saying of being drunk made sense. He slightly narrowed his eyes to hide his nervousness and pretended to be calm, saying, "I won't go back tonight. It's not good for you to drink and have fun with your classmates." Dewdrop smiled and teased, "Where's the elegance?" Ning Ke said under the influence of the liquor, "I'm just a little soldier who was sent here. How would I know what elegance is? My good sister, how about letting me be vulgar tonight? Don't pretend to be crazy when you're drunk. You'll regret it when you wake up." Dewdrop laughed and said, "If you're sober on normal days, let alone once, I can even let you be vulgar 3 times. So what?" Ning Ke squinted his drunk eyes and waved his hand repeatedly. He said with a silly smile, "That won't do. That would be the 3 vulgarities. I can't listen to this nonsense anymore." Situilan frowned and covered her forehead to suppress the rolling drunkenness in her stomach. She said, "Ning Ke, if you want to fool around, can't you pick another day?" Ning Ke reluctantly stood up and bowed deeply. He said, "Miss Situ, this is the place you picked. If it were another day, I really wouldn't have the guts to accompany a girl to a brothel." Situilan was speechless for a moment. She glared at him and thought, "You still know that you're accompanying a girl to a brothel? Then why don't we just listen to some songs, watch some dance, and talk about art and life? Why do we have to do this?" Fortunately, she did not say this out loud. Otherwise, Ning Ke would have ridiculed her for a long time about the difference between artistic young girls and normal young girls. Dewdrop smiled and looked at Ning Quebec. She said sympathetically, "Ning Ke, you seem to have forgotten one thing. Mistress Jian has said that no one is allowed to entertain you. Where can you go?" As soon as Dewdrop finished her words, an arrogant and indifferent little maidservant appeared in front of everyone with a bowl of fish-tail soup. She was Mistress Jian's personal maidservant, Xiao Chao. She stared at Ning Ke's eyes coldly and said, "Mistress Jian has said that no one is allowed to let him drink it. Ning Ke, you drink this bowl of soup and immediately take a bath to get rid of the stench on you. Then, follow me upstairs. Mistress Jian has something to ask you." In novels, there was a common sentence to describe the behavior of a master, and that was, "It takes a long time to say it, but it happens in the blink of an eye." The maidservant Xiao Chao appeared just like this, and her words were also very effective. As soon as she said this, those eager academy students were stopped by the girls around them. Ning Ke even let go of the flagon dejectedly. The whole hall was silent. When Ning Ke went to wash up, the academy students in the building inevitably talked about what had happened earlier. Especially those Chang and students who knew Mistress Jian's identity, they could not help but talk about some secrets in the palace and a certain legend of the Tang Empire. Therefore, everyone was more curious about what had happened earlier. It was still quiet beside the railing. Situilan and Jean Wuxia whispered a few words to each other before walking over again. She stood not far from Dewdrop and looked curiously at this outstanding figure in the brothel in the capital city. She asked softly, even if Ning Ke was lucky enough to catch Mistress Jian's attention, no matter you or Lu Shui, with your current status, you don't need to deliberately curry favor with him. Therefore, I'm very curious about why. It's interesting that Ning Ke was tricked into this brothel. That night, Mistress Jian made it clear that the girls in this brothel are not allowed to serve him. It's okay for other brothels in Chang'an, but none of the girls in this brothel dare to disobey Mistress Jian's order. However, he still comes here often. What does this mean? Dewdrop's eyes moved and she replied softly with a smile, this means that the young man comes here to chat with us girls, and we, in fact, really want to chat with him. Situilan supported her chin with her hand and leaned against the railing thoughtfully. Dewdrop smiled and continued, we like to chat with him because we can't just chat with him in our daily chats. We always have to think about how to make those censors happy and vice ministers happy. And Ning Ke likes to chat with us because he has pressure in his bones and needs to chat to relax. Now it seems that he can only really relax by chatting with girls like us in a place like this. Situilan frowned and her eyes were filled with the curiosity of a young girl. What pressure can he have? I don't know what's wrong with Ning Ke's life, but I know there must be something wrong. Dewdrop gradually stopped smiling and said pitifully, in your eyes, Ning Ke is just a calm and simple lad. Only the poor people like us, who have seen countless hardships, can see the pitifulness hidden in his body. Finally, this popular girl in Chang'an said softly, besides, I'm also an orphan without parents. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.